The gunshot echoed across the Colorado mountains, swallowed by the howling December wind of 1878. William Iron Will Wren lowered his weathered Springfield rifle, squinting through the swirling snow. The old cavalry weapon felt heavy in his calloused hands. Hands that had built this homestead from nothing, hands that had once taken lives in a war that still haunted his dreams. "Come out," he called, his voice carried away by the wind. "I won't ask twice." The shadow by his barn moved again, not the fluid movement of a coyote or wolf. Human. Trespassers meant trouble, especially 15 miles from the nearest outpost, especially in a blizzard that had raged for 3 days straight. Will cocked the rifle again. He'd buried his Mercy alongside Elizabeth 2 winters ago when the avalanche took her. Now, there was only Rose to think about, his 4-year-old daughter, sleeping inside their cabin, the only light left in his life. The figure staggered forward, emerging from the white void. Not the broad shoulders of a man, but the slender form of a woman. Her cloak was torn and crusted with ice, her face barely visible beneath a snow-caked hood. She held up her hands, one clutching a small leather pouch, both red and raw from frostbite. "I can sleep in the barn," the woman said, her voice surprisingly steady despite her condition. "I just need shelter from the cold. Please." Will didn't lower his rifle. He'd seen desperation take many forms during the war. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies were those who appeared weakest. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Where'd you come from?" The woman swayed slightly, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "My name is Mira," she said. I can't remember the rest." Will's finger tensed on the trigger. Amnesia was a convenient claim. "You're a long way from anywhere to be out in this storm alone." "I know." She didn't elaborate, didn't plead further. There was dignity in her silence, a strength that seemed at odds with her ragged appearance. The wind picked up, driving ice crystals against Will's face like tiny needles. He should send her away. His homestead claim was 15 miles from Summit Junction, the nearest whistle stop along the new railroad line. No one came this far into the high country without purpose, especially not a lone woman in winter. "Move along," he said finally. "Summit Junction's southeast. Follow the valley." "I'll die before I make 5 miles." She stated it as simple fact, not manipulation. "The temperature's dropping. I can work for my keep. I'm asking for the barn, not your home." Will's jaw tightened. The code of the frontier demanded certain courtesies even from a hardened man like himself. You didn't leave anyone to die in a blizzard if you could help it. But Rose came first. Always Rose. "I don't take in strangers," he said, the words bitter on his tongue. "Not anymore." The woman lowered her hands slowly, resignation in the movement. She nodded once, as if she'd expected nothing more. Then she turned back toward the whiteout, toward certain death. Behind Will, the cabin door creaked. His heart lurched. "Rose, get back inside." But his daughter stood in the doorway, her nightgown billowing in the wind, her small feet bare on the frozen porch. 4 years old and tiny for her age, with Elizabeth's auburn hair falling in tangled curls around her face. Her eyes, large and solemn, fixed on the stranger. "Rose, go back to bed." Will ordered, his voice gentler but firm. Rose didn't move. She hadn't spoken a word since finding Elizabeth's body in the snow 2 years ago. The local doctor called it trauma-induced mutism. Will called it a wound deeper than any he'd received in battle. Then something impossible happened. Rose's lips parted. Her voice, unused for so long, emerged as a hoarse whisper that cut through the howling wind with unnatural clarity. "Mama, Will froze, rifle half-lowered, breath caught in his throat. The stranger's head snapped up her eyes, a startling shade of green, widening in shock. "She's not your mother, Rose," Will said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Your mama's gone." Rose shook her head with sudden vehemence. "She smells like the dream," she insisted, her voice stronger now. "I prayed for her to come." The woman stood transfixed, her expression a mixture of confusion and something Will couldn't decipher. Not deception, something more complex. Recognition impossible. "Please, Papa," Rose whispered. "She's cold." Will looked between his daughter speaking for the first time in 2 years, and the mysterious woman swaying in the snow. Every instinct told him to send the stranger away. But Rose's voice— "The barn," he said, finally lowering his rifle, but not putting it aside. "You can stay in the barn tonight. One night. There's straw in the back corner." Relief crossed the woman's face, but not the effusive gratitude he might have expected. Just a soldier's nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you," she said simply. Will watched as she trudged toward the barn, her steps faltering but determined. He noted the way she moved, scanning her surroundings even in her exhausted state, maintaining awareness of his position. Not the movements of a lost traveler, more like someone hunted. "Inside Rose," he said, guiding his daughter back to the cabin's warmth, his eyes never leaving the stranger until she disappeared into the barn. Once inside, he bolted the door and added wood to the fire. Rose climbed onto the bench at their rough-hewn table, her eyes bright with an animation he hadn't seen since Elizabeth died. "She was in my dream, Papa," Rose said, the words tumbling out, as if making up for 2 years of silence. "The lady with green eyes. She was running through the snow and she was scared, but she was looking for us." Will knelt beside his daughter, searching her face. "Rose, honey, you've never seen that woman before." "I have," Rose insisted. "In the dream, 3 times. She was holding a special box and running from bad men." A chill that had nothing to do with the storm crawled up Will's spine. What bad men, Rose? But Rose had fallen silent again, staring toward the window where snow plastered itself against the glass. Will tucked her back into bed, waiting until her breathing slowed into sleep. Then he retrieved his rifle and the old Army Colt revolver from the trunk beneath his bed. He would not sleep tonight. Perhaps not for many nights. Dawn broke gray and grudging over the mountains. The blizzard had passed, leaving 3 feet of fresh snow blanketing the small homestead. Will, who had dozed fitfully in the chair by the fire, his pistol in his lap, wore stiffly to check on their guest. The barn was 20 yards from the cabin, a sturdy structure built to withstand the brutal mountain winters. As he approached, Winchester rifle in hand, he considered what he knew a woman calling herself Mira had appeared during one of the worst blizzards in years. She claimed amnesia, but moved like someone with military training. And somehow, inexplicably, his mute daughter not only spoke to her, but claimed to have dreamed of her arrival. None of it made sense, and in Will Wren's experience, things that didn't make sense were usually dangerous. He found the woman awake, sitting on a milking stool, feeding kindling into the small iron stove he kept in the barn for the worst winter nights. She'd removed her cloak, revealing clothing that, despite being muddied and torn, was of finer quality than he'd initially realized. Her boots, though scuffed, were expensive, the kind officers had worn during the war. Most tellingly, when she turned at his approach, he caught sight of a puckered scar at the base of her neck, the distinctive mark of a bullet wound. "Good morning," she said, rising to her feet without haste. No sudden movements. She knew how to behave around an armed man. "Who shot you?" Will asked without preamble, gesturing toward her neck with the rifle barrel. Her hand moved unconsciously to the scar fingers tracing its outline. "I don't remember," she said, but something flickered in her eyes. A shadow of recollection, perhaps. "You're lying." "Not entirely." She met his gaze steadily. "I remember the pain, the sound. I remember running through snow much like last night's, but not who or why." She paused. "Or at least I don't remember clearly. There are fragments." Will studied her. Early 30s, he guessed. Beneath the grime of travel, her features were striking high cheekbones, determined chin, those unusual green eyes. Her dark hair was escaping from what had once been an elegant knot at the nape of her neck. She stood with perfect posture, despite her obvious exhaustion. "You fought in the war," he stated rather than asked. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Women weren't allowed to fight, Mr. Wren." "No, but they served as spies, couriers, nurses." He narrowed his eyes. "And you've been shot. Recently." "How do you know my name?" he countered, ignoring her evasion. "I never gave it." "Your daughter called you Papa. The name Wren is burned into the barn door lintel." She shrugged slightly. "I observe. It's something I remember how to do." Will grunted, another piece that didn't fit. This was no ordinary traveler. "I made coffee," he said abruptly. "Come to the house. We'll talk there." She hesitated, glancing at her meager belongings, the cloak, the small leather pouch. "Bring your things," he added. "I want to see what you're carrying." She gathered her possessions without protest and followed him through the snow to the cabin. Inside, Rose was already awake, feeding kindling to the fire with the careful attention of a child raised to respect its danger. When she saw Mira, her face lit up with a smile Will had thought lost forever. "You stayed," Rose said, as if she'd feared otherwise. "I did," Mira replied, her voice softening. Will gestured to the table. "Sit. Coffee's hot." As he poured 3 mugs from the battered tin pot, he watched Mira taking in the cabin, the single main room with its stone fireplace, the ladder leading to the loft where Rose slept, the curtained-off area that served as his bedroom. Her gaze lingered on the photographs on the mantel. Elizabeth holding infant Rose Will in his Union cavalry uniform. The 3 of them together before the avalanche changed everything. "Your wife?" she asked quietly. "Elizabeth, 2 years gone this February." His voice was flat, matter-of-fact. He'd learned to speak of Elizabeth without breaking, though the wound remained raw. "Avalanche swept her half a mile. By the time I found her, it was too late." Mira nodded, offering no platitudes. Will was grateful for that. "Your pouch," he said, setting coffee before her. "Show me." Without protest, she placed the small leather sack on the table and opened it. Inside was a silver compass, an empty journal bound in faded red leather, a pencil, and a peculiar brass key with an intricate bit. "That's all I have," she said. Will picked up the compass. It was military issue, the kind given to Union officers during the war. The initials ML were engraved on the back. "M for Mira," he said. "What's L? Langston, perhaps?" She frowned. "The name feels familiar." "Mira Langston." Rose tried the name, nodding with the certainty only a child could possess. "That's right." Will examined the key next. Unlike the compass, it appeared old, possibly European, in design with a complex pattern on its shaft. "And this? You don't remember what it opens?" "No." But again, that flicker in her eyes. Will returned the items to the pouch, his suspicion undiminished. "You're welcome to breakfast," he said, "and to clean up. Then we need to discuss your situation." Mira's hands curled around the coffee mug, absorbing its warmth. "My situation. Summit Junction's snowbound for at least a week after a storm like this. You can't reach it, and I can't take you there." He met her gaze directly. "That means you're here until the pass is clear. I need to know if that puts my daughter in danger." She didn't flinch from his directness. "I don't believe I'm dangerous, Mr. Wren, but given my incomplete memories, I can't make promises about who might be looking for me." It was more honesty than he'd expected. Will nodded once, acknowledging it. "Then we established terms. You can stay in the cabin, it's too cold for the barn with this weather. You'll help with chores, cooking, watching Rose when I'm out hunting. In return, you get food, shelter, and safety until the snow clears enough for travel." "That's more than fair," she agreed. "One more thing." His voice hardened. "If I see anything at all that suggests you're a threat to Rose, I won't hesitate. Understand perfectly." Her gaze was level, unafraid. "I would expect nothing less from a father." Will pushed back from the table. "I need to check the livestock clear paths. Rose, show Miss Langston where things are." As he donned his coat and gloves, he watched Rose eagerly leading Mira to the water barrel, chattering about the cabin as if she'd never been silent. The woman listened attentively, responding with gentle questions that made Rose smile. It was like witnessing a miracle, one that filled him with both hope and dread, because miracles, in Will Wren's experience, came with prices too steep to bear. By midday, Will had cleared paths to the barn, the outhouse, and the well. The sky had turned a brittle blue, the sun reflecting blindingly off the fresh snow. Cold enough that his breath formed clouds with each exhale. But the worst of the storm had passed. When he returned to the cabin, he found it transformed. The floors had been swept, the breakfast dishes washed and put away. Rose sat at the table, bent over her primer, sounding out letters with more enthusiasm than she'd shown in months. And Mira stood at the wash basin, her back to him. She'd bathed and changed into what must be her only other set of clothes, a simple blouse and skirt, both of good quality but well worn. Her damp hair hung in a thick braid down her back. But what arrested Will's attention was what he could now clearly see. The scar on her neck was, indeed, a bullet wound, and it wasn't old. 6 months, perhaps a year at most. Someone had tried to kill this woman. Recently. She turned, sensing his presence, and he quickly averted his gaze, busying himself with removing his snow-crusted boots. "Your daughter is quite bright," she said, drying her hands on a towel. "She knows most of her letters already." "Elizabeth taught her," Will replied. "Before." Mira nodded, understanding the weight those 2 words carried. "I found a stew pot and some vegetables in the root cellar. I hope it was all right to start lunch." "That's fine." He hung his coat by the door, noticing how spotless the hooks were now. "You didn't need to clean." "I don't like to be idle." She returned to the stove, stirring something that already smelled better than anything he'd managed to cook in months. "And I believe in earning my keep." Will sat at the table beside Rose, who showed him her primer with pride. "Look, Papa, I remembered M and L for Miss Mira Langston. That's good, Rosie." He smoothed her hair, marveling at the change in her. 2 years of silence broken overnight by a stranger who appeared in a blizzard. A stranger his daughter claimed to have seen in dreams. As Rose returned to her letters, Will studied Mira covertly. There was efficiency in her movements, economy, no wasted motion. She navigated his small kitchen as if she'd cooked in far more challenging conditions, field kitchens perhaps. "You said there are fragments you remember," he said quietly, not wanting to draw Rose's attention. "What fragments?" Mira continued stirring the stew, her back to him. "Snow," she said after a moment. "Like last night. Running, the sensation of falling. A train whistle. She hesitated. And paper, letters or documents, something important. Important enough to get shot over, her hand stilled on the ladle. Perhaps? Will considered this. Letters or documents valuable enough to kill for meant military information or perhaps political secrets. Either way, dangerous. When I found you, he said, lowering his voice further, you were heading northwest, away from the railroad, away from any town. Why, I don't know. She turned to face him, her expression troubled. I only know I felt I had to keep moving, that it wasn't safe to stay in one place. And now, do you feel safe here? Something softened in her face as she glanced at Rose. Safer than I have in a long time, I think. Before Will could respond, a sharp cracking sound came from outside like a branch breaking under the weight of snow. His hand went instinctively to the rifle propped by the door. Stay inside, he ordered, moving to the window. Through the glass, he scanned the tree line at the edge of his property. Nothing moved except a magpie flitting between pines. The mountains stood silent, indifferent. But 20 years of soldiering had taught Will to trust his instincts, and those instincts were screaming now. They were being watched. That night, after Rose had gone to sleep in the loft, Will sat cleaning his rifle by the fire. Mira sat across from him, mending a tear in her cloak with neat, precise stitches. The domesticity of the scene was deceptive. Tension hummed beneath the surface, unspoken questions hanging in the air. You were Union cavalry, she said, finally breaking the silence. Not a question. Will glanced up. 2nd Cavalry Company D. You recognized the insignia on my photograph. She nodded. I also recognized how you move, how you check sight lines, how you positioned yourself between me and Rose until you determined I wasn't an immediate threat. And how would you know what to look for, Miss Langston? A faint smile touched her lips. Perhaps I knew many soldiers. Perhaps, Will set aside his cleaning rod. Or perhaps you were military intelligence, a courier or spy. Women weren't allowed such roles, officially. Officially. He repeated the word, its meaning clear between them. During the war, both sides had employed women in roles that would never appear in any record. Were you at Antietam? The name sparked something. He could see it in the sudden tension in her shoulders, the quick intake of breath. I don't know, she said, but uncertainty clouded her voice. September 1862, he pressed. Bloodiest day of the war. I was there. Lost half my company crossing Burnside Bridge. Mira's fingers had stilled on her sewing. Her eyes took on a distant quality as if seeing something far away. Water, she whispered. The creek was red with it. And the cornfield. All those men. Will leaned forward. You were there. She blinked, returning to the present with visible effort. Fragments, she said again, her voice unsteady. Just fragments. Will watched her for a long moment. She wasn't lying, not entirely. But she wasn't telling the whole truth either. The question was whether her secrets posed a danger to Rose. Get some sleep, he said finally, nodding to the bedroll he'd prepared near the fire. I'll take first watch. She looked up sharply. You believe we need a watch? I believe in caution, he replied, not mentioning the sense of being observed he'd felt earlier. Habit from the war. Mira nodded, setting aside her mending. Wake me for the second half of the night. I don't need much sleep. Another soldier's trait. Will didn't argue. He watched as she arranged herself on the bedroll facing the door, one hand beneath the small bundle that served as her pillow, where he suspected she kept the brass key. Within moments her breathing deepened and slowed, but he noted how lightly she slept, stirring at every creak of the cabin's timbers. Will added wood to the fire and settled into his chair rifle across his knees. Outside, the night was preternaturally quiet, the landscape transformed into something alien and pristine by the fresh snow. The mountains kept their secrets well, as did the woman sleeping before his hearth. But secrets had a way of revealing themselves, often in blood. 3 hours later, he was nearly dozing himself when Mira cried out in her sleep, a sound of such terror and anguish that he was on his feet instantly, rifle raised. "Burn them!" she gasped, her body rigid with fear. "Burn the letters. They are coming." Will knelt beside her, careful not to touch her. Waking a soldier from a nightmare could be dangerous. "Mira," he said firmly, "wake up. You're dreaming." Her eyes flew open, wild and unseeing at first. Then awareness returned, followed by mortification. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "What letters?" he asked, not unkindly. She sat up, pushing a hair from her face with a trembling hand. "I don't know. In the dream, I was carrying something. Letters or documents. Someone was pursuing me. I needed to destroy them before—" She shook her head. It faded already. But Will had seen the terror in her eyes. Whatever she'd been dreaming, it wasn't just a nightmare. It was memory. "Try to sleep again," he said, returning to his chair. "I'll keep watch." Mira lay back down, but he could tell by her breathing that sleep eluded her now. After a while, she spoke again, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Mr. Wren," she said, "do you believe it's possible to do terrible things for the right reasons?" The question caught him off guard with its rawness. He considered it carefully before answering. "I believe war forces choices on us that peace never would," he said finally. "I've done things I'm not proud of, things that haunt me, but I did them believing they were necessary." "And now do you still believe they were necessary?" Will stared into the flames, seeing not the fire, but the battlefields of his past. "Some," he admitted. "Others, I'm not so sure anymore." Mira was silent for so long, he thought she'd fallen asleep. Then, "Thank you for your honesty." "Get some rest," he said again. "Whatever's coming, we'll face it better with clear heads." She closed her eyes, and this time her breathing eventually settled into the rhythm of true sleep. Will remained vigilant, watching over both the mysterious woman and his daughter, sleeping in the loft above. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentler, now lazy flakes drifting in the moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled a lonely sound that seemed to echo the emptiness Will had carried since Elizabeth's death. But for the first time in 2 years, that emptiness felt a little less absolute. 5 days passed in a strange, suspended harmony. The snow continued intermittently, keeping the passes closed, isolating the small homestead from the wider world. Will maintained his vigilance, but no threat materialized from the surrounding wilderness. Inside the cabin, a routine established itself. Mira proved herself useful beyond Will's expectations, cooking meals that made Rose's thin cheeks fill out, teaching the girl her letters with patient enthusiasm, even mending clothing with a skill Elizabeth had never mastered. She split kindling with the same efficiency she applied to everything, the axe swinging in smooth, practiced arcs that spoke of strength beyond her slender frame. Most remarkably, Rose bloomed in her presence. The child who had been silent for 2 years now chattered constantly, following Miss Mira, everywhere absorbing knowledge like parched earth drinks rain. She told Mira about Elizabeth, memories Will had feared lost forever, and asked endless questions about the world beyond their mountain. Will found himself both grateful and uneasy. He'd lived with grief for so long that its absence felt like a betrayal. Yet watching his daughter laugh again loosened something tight around his heart. On the sixth morning, Will rose before dawn to hunt. They needed meat, and the brief break in snowfall provided an opportunity he couldn't ignore. He dressed quietly, not wanting to wake Rose or Mira. But as he reached for his rifle, a soft voice came from the hearth. "You're going hunting." Mira sat up from her bedroll, fully alert despite the early hour. She'd taken to sleeping in her clothes, ready to move at a moment's notice, another habit that spoke of her mysterious past. "We need venison," he confirmed, keeping his voice low. "I'll be back by midday." She nodded, rising to stoke the fire. "I'll have coffee ready when you return." Will hesitated, then made a decision. "There's a Colt revolver in the trunk beneath my bed. 6 shots fully loaded. If anyone comes while I'm gone, I know how to use it," she assured him, confirming what he'd already suspected. "Keep Rose safe," he said, the words both request and warning. "With my life," she replied simply. Will believed her. Despite his lingering suspicions about her past, he'd seen how she looked at Rose with a protectiveness that matched his own. Whatever Mira Langston might have done, whatever secrets she carried, her affection for his daughter was genuine. He ventured into the pre-dawn darkness, moving silently through snow that crunched beneath his boots. The air was knife-sharp in his lungs, the stars still brilliant overhead. He took the western trail, climbing toward the ridge, where deer often browsed the mountain mahogany. 2 hours later, with a young buck dressed and slung across his shoulders, Will turned back toward home. The sun had cleared the eastern peaks, casting long blue shadows across the pristine snow. From this elevation, he could see his cabin smoke rising straight from the chimney in the still morning air. The cleared paths like dark stitches in a white quilt. Then he saw something else, movement on the trail below. Riders. 3 of them approaching from the direction of Summit Junction. Will dropped to one knee, shrugging the deer carcass from his shoulders. He pulled his field glass from his pack and focused on the distant figures. The lead rider wore the dark uniform of the Continental Railroad and Mining Company, the corporate giant pushing the rails through Colorado's high country. The other 2 were armed men, likely company police. They moved with purpose, following the trail directly toward his homestead. No one from the railroad had business this far from the main line. No one except someone looking for something or someone. Will abandoned the deer carcass and began running down the mountain, taking the quickest route through dense pines. He had to reach the cabin before those riders, had to warn Mira, because somehow he knew with cold certainty that they had come for her. Mira sensed something was wrong before she heard the approaching horses. A stillness in the air, perhaps, or some instinct honed by experiences she couldn't fully remember. She set aside the primer she'd been reviewing with Rose and moved to the window. 3 riders were approaching from the east, following the trail that led from Summit Junction. The lead rider wore a uniform she recognized instantly, though she couldn't have said why. Continental Railroad and Mining Company. Executive grade. Something lurched in her stomach, recognition, fear. "Rose," she said calmly, turning from the window. "Let's play the hiding game." Rose looked up, eyes widening. She was perceptive enough to sense Mira's tension. "Are bad men coming?" "I'm not sure," Mira replied honestly. "But your father would want you safe until he returns." She moved quickly to Will's bedroom, retrieving the Colt revolver from the trunk. The weapon felt familiar in her hand, too familiar. She checked the chambers automatically, movements practiced despite her fragmentary memories. "Come," she said, guiding Rose to the trapdoor hidden beneath the braided rug, a root cellar Will had dug before his first winter on the homestead. "Stay quiet until your father or I come for you. Like a mouse, remember." Rosie nodded solemnly. "Like a mouse." She climbed down the rough ladder, clutching the rag doll Mira had made for her. "Will you be all right, Miss Mira?" Mira forced a reassuring smile. "Of course. It's just a precaution." She closed the trap door and replaced the rug, then positioned herself by the window, Colt hidden in the folds of her skirt. The riders were closer now. The leader was a tall man with ramrod-straight posture and a close-cropped silver beard. Something about him tugged at her memory, something that made her pulse quicken with instinctive dread. As they neared the cabin, she saw his face clearly for the first time. Images flooded her mind with such violence that she gasped aloud. Snow falling, the crack of a pistol, pain blossoming in her neck, and the man's voice cold as the mountain winter. "You betrayed your oath, Langston." Colonel Marcus Blackwood, Continental Railroad executive, former Union intelligence officer, the man who had tried to kill her, the man she had been running from. Mira's fingers tightened on the Colt. Her breathing steadied as training reasserted itself through the fog of amnesia. She knew what he wanted. She knew why he'd come, and she knew with perfect clarity that she could not let him find Rose. The riders halted before the cabin. Blackwood dismounted with the fluid grace of a much younger man, his bearing unmistakably military despite his corporate uniform. He surveyed the homestead with cold calculation, then approached the door. As his fist raised to knock, a rifle shot cracked from the western ridge, a warning deliberately high. Will Wren's voice carried clear in the winter air. "That's far enough, gentlemen. State your business or turn around." Blackwood turned unruffled by the threat. His voice, when he called back, confirmed every half-remembered nightmare. "We're looking for a fugitive, Mr. Wren. A dangerous woman. We have reason to believe she's here." Inside the cabin, Mira stepped back from the window, heart pounding. Her fragmented memories were coalescing pieces of a deadly puzzle falling into place. She remembered who she was now, what she had done, why she had run. And she knew that as long as she stayed, Will and Rose Wren would never be safe. Will Wren kept his rifle trained on the three riders as he descended the ridge, moving with the practiced stealth of a veteran scout. Inside the cabin, Mira would have hidden Rose by now. He trusted her that much, at least. But these men with their Continental Railroad uniforms and well-oiled weapons represented a threat he hadn't anticipated so soon. Colonel Marcus Blackwood stood impassively in the yard, seemingly unconcerned by the rifle aimed in his direction. His two companions, hard-faced men with the watchful eyes of experienced gunmen, had positioned themselves on either side, hands resting near holstered revolvers. "That's close enough," Will called when he was 30 yards out. "This is private property under the Homestead Act. State your business." Blackwood's silver beard caught the winter sunlight as he smiled a gesture that never reached his eyes. "Sergeant William Wren, 2nd Cavalry Company D, Distinguished Service at Antietam and Gettysburg." He spoke as if reading from a dossier. "I hadn't realized this was your homestead." Will's finger tensed on the trigger. Few people knew his military record, fewer still his former rank. "You have me at a disadvantage." Colonel Marcus Blackwood, formerly of Union Army Intelligence, now Executive Director of Continental Railroad and Mining. The man's voice carried the clipped precision of an officer accustomed to command. "These men are Bradford and Sullivan Company security." Will kept his expression neutral, though his mind raced. Union intelligence explained how Blackwood knew him. They'd kept files on every soldier. But it didn't explain what brought him to a remote homestead 15 miles from the nearest rail line. Except it did. It explained everything. "What fugitive are you looking for, Colonel?" Will asked, stopping 20 feet away, rifle still ready. "A woman named Mira Langston, former intelligence operative. She absconded with classified military documents 6 months ago and disappeared into the Colorado Territory. Blackwood's gaze swept the cabin. We received reports of a woman matching her description in this area. Dark hair, green eyes, bullet scar on her neck, where one of my men winged her during her escape. Will's expression betrayed nothing, though his pulse quickened. Haven't seen anyone like that. No, Blackwood's eyes narrowed. The station master at Summit Junction said a woman fitting that description passed through before the blizzard, headed this direction. Many people pass through these mountains. Few survive winter storms. Indeed, Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. Which is why I find it curious that someone cleared a path to your barn recently. He gestured to the neat track Will had shoveled days ago. You expecting visitors, Sergeant? Will lowered his rifle slightly, not enough to surrender his advantage, but enough to appear reasonable. Colonel, I've got venison to dress and a daughter to feed. If your fugitive came this way, she didn't stop here. Now, unless you've got a warrant. The Continental Railroad doesn't need warrants, Sergeant. We have federal authority to secure our routes against threats. Blackwood's tone hardened. And Mira Langston represents a significant threat to national security. Then take it up with the territorial marshal in Denver, Will replied. This is my land, and you're trespassing. For a long moment Blackwood held his gaze, the air between them charged with unspoken tension. Then the colonel smiled again, that same cold expression that never touched his eyes. Very well, Sergeant. We'll continue our search elsewhere. He nodded to his men, who mounted their horses with reluctance. But understand this, if I discover you're harboring a fugitive, the consequences will extend beyond legal penalties. The Continental Railroad has invested heavily in this territory. We have the power to ensure your homestead claim is reevaluated. The threat wasn't subtle. Railroad companies wielded enormous influence in the territories, often determining which claims were validated and which were conveniently found to have paperwork irregularities. Is that all, Colonel? Will kept his voice steady, betraying none of the anger simmering beneath. For now. Blackwood mounted his horse with the ease of a man who'd spent decades in the saddle. But we'll be watching Sergeant Wren. The railroad always gets what it wants in the end. Will stood motionless as the three riders departed, following the trail back toward Summit Junction. Only when they disappeared around the bend did he lower his rifle and exhale slowly, tension draining from his shoulders. He hurried to the cabin, pushing open the door, to find Mira standing by the window, Colt revolver in hand, her face pale but composed. Rose, he asked immediately. In the root cellar. Safe. She lowered the revolver. You heard? Enough. Will moved to the braided rug, pulling it aside to reveal the trap door. Rose, all clear, honey. The child emerged moments later, climbing the rough ladder with practiced ease. She ran to Will, wrapping her arms around his waist. The bad men are gone, she asked, face tilted up to his, for now. Will smoothed her hair, then looked at Mira over Rose's head. We need to talk. Mira nodded, her expression grave. Yes, we do. Dad. Later, after Rose had been settled with her primer and a promise of venison stew for dinner, Will and Mira stood outside the cabin. The winter afternoon was waning, shadows lengthening across the snow, temperature dropping as the sun slid toward the western peaks. Their breath formed clouds in the frigid air. You're remembering, Will said. Not a question. Mira pulled her cloak tighter against the cold. Yes, seeing Blackwood, it unlocked something. Names, faces, fragments of what happened. She met his gaze directly. You deserve the truth, Mr. Wren, as much as I know. Which is, I am Mira Langston. During the war, I worked for Union intelligence under Colonel Blackwood. My father was a professor of linguistics at Harvard. I speak 5 languages and was trained in codes, ciphers, and information gathering. Her voice was steady, detached, as if reciting facts about someone else. I served as a courier and occasional field operative behind Confederate lines. Will studied her face, finding no deception there. And after the war, Blackwood recruited me for a special division within the Continental Railroad. Officially, we gathered information on land for potential rail lines. Unofficially, she hesitated, we eliminated obstacles to the railroad's expansion, by any means necessary. Obstacles, Will repeated. You mean people. Mira's expression tightened. Homesteaders who refused to sell. Territorial officials who couldn't be bribed. Native tribes with inconvenient treaty rights. Shame colored her voice. I told myself it was for progress for the nation's future. I was wrong. Will processed this, his expression unreadable. What changed 6 months ago? I discovered Blackwood was planning something worse than usual. A deliberate provocation against the Ute tribe in northern Colorado, burning villages, destroying winter stores, designed to trigger a response that would justify military intervention and nullify their treaty rights. Her hands clenched beneath her cloak. Hundreds would have died, all to secure a more profitable rail route. And you took evidence of this plan, Will surmised. Letters, orders, maps, everything needed to expose what they intended. Her green eyes flashed with sudden fire. I couldn't stand by anymore. Not for that. So Blackwood sent men after you. He came himself. Her hand moved unconsciously to the scar on her neck. Caught me near Pueblo. Said I'd betrayed my oath to the company, to the country. He shot me, thought I was dead. I woke hours later in a snowdrift, disoriented, bleeding. She shook her head. Much of what happened after is still hazy. I remember traveling north, avoiding towns, then the blizzard and your cabin. Will was silent for a long moment, weighing her words against the desperate arrival he'd witnessed, the nightmares that plagued her sleep, the way she moved like a hunted animal. The documents, he said finally. Where are they now? Mira's gaze dropped. I don't know. I must have hidden them somewhere before I was shot. But that memory hasn't returned. Frustration edged her voice. I remember the compass, the key. They're important somehow, connected to where I concealed the evidence. That's why Blackwood wants you. Not just for revenge, but because you're the only one who knows where the documents are hidden. Yes, and he won't stop looking. Her eyes met his again, resolute now. Which is why I should leave as soon as the weather permits. Every day I stay puts you and Rose in danger. Will turned away, looking toward the mountains, where shadows deepened with approaching dusk. The strategic part of his mind, the soldier who had survived Antietam and Gettysburg, agreed with her assessment. Harboring Mira meant risking everything he'd built here, risking Rose's safety. The sensible choice was clear. And yet, he thought of his daughter's voice, silent for 2 years until Mira arrived. He thought of laughter returning to their cabin, of Rose learning her letters by the fire of meals that tasted of something other than grief and obligation. We have time, he said finally. The northern passes won't clear for weeks yet. Blackwood can't move a significant force through this terrain in winter. He doesn't need a force, Mira countered. Just one man with a rifle. Then we stay vigilant. Will turned back to her. In the meantime, we try to recover more of your memories. Figure out where you hid those documents. They're our best leverage against Blackwood. Mira studied him, surprise evident in her expression. You're willing to risk your homestead, your daughter's safety to help me? Will's weathered face softened slightly. "Rose hasn't spoken in 2 years, Miss Langston. Whatever brought you to my door that night, I'm not convinced it was entirely accidental." He glanced toward the cabin window where Rose's small face peered out at them. "Besides, I've never much liked bullies, especially ones who wear uniforms and hide behind corporate power." A ghost of a smile touched Mira's lips. "Very well, Mr. Wren. We'll try it your way." "Will," he corrected her. "If we're facing down the Continental Railroad together, you might as well use my name." "Will," she echoed the simple syllable hanging between them like a tentative bridge across a chasm neither had intended to cross. From the forest edge came the cry of a hawk, a piercing note against the winter silence. But beneath that natural sound, Will's trained ear caught something else, the distant crack of a branch too deliberate for wind or settling snow. Blackwood hadn't gone far after all. The following dawn broke clear and cold, the thermometer outside the cabin window reading 15 below zero. Will rose early, adding wood to the banked coals in the fireplace, bringing the cabin back to grudging warmth before Rose or Mira stirred. He moved to the window, rifle in hand, and studied the surrounding landscape with the careful attention of a man who knew he was being watched. Nothing moved across the snow-covered clearing. The forest edge remained still, pines laden with white, their shadows blue-black against the pristine ground. But Will knew better than to trust appearances. During the war, he'd learned that the deadliest dangers were those you couldn't see until it was too late. Behind him, Mira rose silently from her bedroll, instantly alert. Like him, she moved to a window scanning the opposite side of the clearing. "Anything?" Will asked softly. "Nothing obvious," she replied. "But they're out there. I can feel it." Will nodded. He felt it too, that prickling awareness at the base of his skull, the subtle tension that had kept him alive through dozens of skirmishes and battles. "We need supplies," he said, keeping his voice low to avoid waking Rose. "I'll make a trip to Summit Junction today." Mira turned sharply. "That's too dangerous. Blackwood will have men watching the trading post." "Precisely why I need to go." Will checked his ammunition pouch. "We need information how many men Blackwood has, what they're telling people, whether he's sent for reinforcements." "It's a risk," she insisted. "Calculated." Will met her gaze steadily. "Better to know what we're facing than wait for it to come to us. Besides, we need flour, coffee, ammunition. Things we can't get by hunting." Mira considered this, then nodded reluctantly. "I'll keep Rose safe while you're gone." "I know you will." He hesitated, then added, "Try working with that key of yours today. See if handling it triggers any memories about the documents." "I've been trying," she admitted. "Last night I dreamed of a train station, a ticket office with brass fittings. The key fit a locker or a box there, but I couldn't see which one before I woke." "That's progress." Will pulled on his heavy coat. "The memories are returning. We just need time." Time they might not have given Blackwood's resources and determination, but neither voiced this concern aloud. Will prepared for the journey quickly, checking his rifle, pistol, and knife, filling his canteen, packing jerky and hardtack in case the 15-mile trip took longer than expected. The weather looked stable, but in Colorado's high country conditions could change within hours. Rose woke as he was finishing his preparations, climbing down from the loft with sleep-tousled hair. "You're leaving, Papa?" "Just to get supplies, Rosie." Will knelt to her level. "I'll be back by nightfall. Miss Mira will stay with you." The child nodded solemnly, then surprised him by throwing her arms around his neck. "Be careful of the bad men," she whispered against his ear. Will held her tight, momentarily overwhelmed by the miracle of her voice, her awareness, her returned affection. For 2 years, she'd been a ghost in his home, physically present, but emotionally absent. Now she was his daughter again, warm and real, and concerned for his safety. He looked over her head at Mira, who watched them with an expression he couldn't quite decipher, something between longing and resolve. "I'll return before dark," he told them both, rising to his feet. "Bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me." Mira nodded, one hand resting on the Colt revolver she now kept in her skirt pocket. "We'll be ready if anyone comes." Will stepped into the bitter morning breath, freezing in his beard, as he surveyed the clearing once more. Still nothing visible, but the sense of being observed remained. He shouldered his pack and rifle, then set off down the trail toward Summit Junction, senses alert for any sign of ambush. Behind him, the cabin door closed with a solid thunk, followed by the sound of the bar sliding into place. Summit Junction consisted of little more than a whistle-stop train platform, a trading post that doubled as a post office, a livery stable, and a rough saloon that served the railroad workers and occasional travelers. A dozen log cabins clustered nearby, housing the station agent telegraph operator and a handful of permanent residents who served the railroad's needs. Will approached cautiously, using the cover of pine forests, until he was within sight of the settlement. From his vantage point, he counted 3 horses outside the trading post, none belonging to Blackwood's party from yesterday, but one bearing the Continental Railroad brand on its saddle blanket. The company had men in town as expected. He adjusted his course, circling wide to approach from the opposite direction, where the stable would provide cover. The bitter cold worked in his favor. Few people lingered outdoors, making his arrival less noticeable. The stable was empty, save for the hostler. Old Tom, a one-legged Confederate veteran who'd found his way west after the war, like so many displaced soldiers seeking new beginnings. "Ren," the old man greeted him without surprise. "Figured you'd be snowbound up at your place after that blizzard." "Needed supplies." Will stamped snow from his boots. "Quiet around here lately." Tom snorted, continuing to muck out a stall. "Until yesterday. Then we had railroad men all over asking questions about some woman fugitive." He spat into the straw. "Offering reward money, too. $500. Will kept his expression neutral. "That's a lot of coin." "Ain't it just?" Tom leaned on his pitchfork. "Said she stole railroad property. Company secrets or some such. Dangerous, they claimed." He eyed Will shrewdly. "You seen anybody unusual up your way?" "Just snow and more snow," Will replied easily. "What else did they say about this woman?" "Dark-haired, green-eyed. Bullet wound on her neck." Tom shrugged. "Colonel High and Mighty made it sound like she's some kind of spy. Left 2 men behind to watch for her. They're over at the trading post now." He hesitated. "There's something else, though. Something that don't sit right." Will tensed. "What's that?" "Overheard one of 'em talking to Simmons at the telegraph office. Said something about your homestead claim being under review. That the railroad might need your land for a spur line." Tom's rheumy eyes narrowed. "Seemed mighty interested in whether you had proper paperwork filed." Cold that had nothing to do with the winter air settled in Will's stomach. The Continental Railroad was notorious for finding technicalities to invalidate homestead claims that stood in their way. A missing form, an improperly notarized document, that was all it took in a territory where corporate influence often outweighed legal rights. "Thanks for the warning, Tom." The old man nodded. "Figured you'd want to know? Those railroad bastards took my brother's place down by Black Creek last year. Said his survey markers were off by 50 feet. 50 feet after 5 years of breaking sod and building." His face darkened with remembered anger. Watch yourself, Wren. They play dirty. Will clapped the man's shoulder in silent gratitude, then slipped out the stable's back door, making his way cautiously toward the trading post. He needed supplies, but more importantly, he needed to gauge what he was up against. The trading post was warm after the frigid outdoors smelling of coffee, tobacco, leather, and wool. A pot-bellied stove radiated heat from the center of the room, surrounded by barrels and crates of goods. The proprietor Jenkins stood behind a rough-hewn counter, while two men in Continental Railroad coats warmed themselves by the stove. Company men watching for Mira, just as Tom had warned. Will nodded to Jenkins and began gathering his supplies: flour, coffee, ammunition, lamp oil, sugar for Rose. He moved unhurriedly, listening to the railroad men's conversation while pretending to study canned goods. "Could be halfway to Denver by now," one was saying, a barrel-chested man with a drooping mustache. "Blackwood doesn't think so," replied the other, leaner and younger. "Says she's injured, low on supplies. Has to be holed up somewhere nearby." "Well, I ain't spending all winter in this god-forsaken outpost on the off chance she wanders in for coffee and beans." "You'll do what the colonel orders if you want to keep your job. Besides, there's that reward money." The conversation shifted to complaints about the cold, giving Will no further intelligence. He brought his supplies to the counter, where Jenkins tallied them with a pencil stub. "Stocking up, Wren?" the shopkeeper asked, eyeing the quantity. "Storm coming I should know about. Just being prepared," Will replied, aware that the railroad men had fallen silent watching him. "How's business? Picked up since the railroad men arrived?" Jenkins lowered his voice. "Heard they're looking for some dangerous woman. You seen any strangers up your way?" "None," Will lied smoothly. "Too remote for most folks, especially in winter." One of the railroad men approached the counter, cup of coffee in hand. "You'd be Wren, then homesteader up north." Will turned slowly, sizing up the man, the younger of the two, with cold eyes and a gun worn low on his hip. "That's right. Colonel Blackwood mentioned he spoke with you yesterday." The man's tone was casual, but his gaze was sharp. "Said you might have information about our fugitive." "Already told the colonel I haven't seen anyone," Will replied. "Just me and my daughter up there." Right. The man nodded, sipping his coffee. "Funny thing, though. The colonel noticed fresh tracks around your place." "Woman-sized boots," he said. Jenkins busied himself with Will's order, pretending not to listen while clearly absorbing every word. "My late wife's," Will said flatly. "I still wear them for hunting." "Less noise." The railroad man's eyebrows rose skeptically, but he didn't challenge the claim directly. "Colonel also mentioned your homestead sits on a potential rail spur route. Valuable land, that." And there it was, the threat thinly veiled but unmistakable. Cooperate, or lose everything. Will counted out coins for his supplies, movements deliberate, unhurried. "My claim's properly filed. 5 years working the land, just like the Homestead Act requires. Paperwork gets lost sometimes." The man shrugged. "Boundaries get disputed. All sorts of complications can arise." He set down his empty cup. "But the railroad's always willing to be reasonable with cooperative citizens." Will met the man's gaze squarely. "I've got nothing to tell Blackwood. No strangers at my place. No tracks except mine and my daughter's." He gathered his supplies into his pack. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got 15 miles to cover before dark." The railroad man stepped aside, but his cold smile promised this wasn't the end of the matter. "Safe travels, Wren. Roads can be dangerous in winter. All sorts of accidents happen to lone travelers." Will shouldered his pack and rifle, nodded to Jenkins, and walked out into the bitter cold, spine straight, betraying none of the anger and concern roiling within him. The threat couldn't have been clearer. Blackwood wasn't just hunting Mira. He was willing to destroy Will's homestead to find her. And if threats against his property didn't work, threats against his life would follow. The journey back would be perilous. Will altered his route, avoiding the main trail, taking a longer path through dense forest where ambush would be more difficult. The temperature was dropping as afternoon waned and clouds gathering in the west promised more snow by nightfall. He increased his pace, pushing through knee-deep drifts, in places alert for any sound that didn't belong to the winter forest. The sense of being followed prickled at the base of his skull, though he caught no glimpse of pursuit. 3 miles from his homestead, as the forest opened into a small clearing, Will heard the distinctive click of a revolver being cocked. "That's far enough, Sergeant Wren," said a familiar voice from behind a lightning-struck pine. "Set down your rifle, slowly." Colonel Marcus Blackwood stepped into view, Remington revolver aimed steadily at Will's chest. "I believe," Blackwood continued, "it's time we had a more honest conversation about Mira Langston." Will Wren had faced death before at Antietam, where cannon fire turned cornfields into slaughterhouses, at Gettysburg, where men fell like wheat before scythes. He recognized its cold breath now, in the winter air, in the unwavering barrel of Blackwood's Remington. "Set down the rifle." Blackwood repeated, his voice calm, as if discussing the weather. "I'm not asking again." Will weighed his options. The distance between them, 30 feet of open ground, made rushing the colonel suicide. The surrounding forest offered cover, but not before Blackwood could fire at least twice. With his pack of supplies weighing him down, Will's chances of outrunning a bullet were non-existent. Slowly, he lowered his Springfield to the snow. "Wise choice, Sergeant." Blackwood gestured with his revolver. "Now the sidearm. 2 fingers only." Will carefully extracted his Colt from its holster, placing it beside the rifle. Unarmed now, he straightened, facing Blackwood, with outward calm that belied the tactical calculations racing through his mind. $500 is a lot of money for a railroad executive to carry into the wilderness, Will remarked, buying time. "Must be important, this fugitive of yours." Blackwood's silver beard caught the waning sunlight as he stepped fully into the clearing, revolver steady. Unlike yesterday, he wore practical frontier clothing beneath his railroad coat, the attire of a man prepared for extended pursuit in harsh conditions. "You misunderstand the situation, Sergeant," Blackwood replied. "I'm not here to bribe you for information. I'm here to offer you a choice." "I'm listening." "Option 1, you tell me where Mira Langston is hiding, along with the documents she stole, and your homestead claim remains secure. The Continental Railroad might even find itself needing to purchase a right-of-way through your property at generous terms naturally." Will's expression remained impassive. "And option 2, I have men watching your cabin as we speak." Blackwood's eyes were cold as the surrounding snow. "If I don't return by nightfall, they have orders to burn it to the ground, with everyone inside." The threat landed like a physical blow, but Will revealed nothing. "Seems extreme for company documents." "Those documents contain military intelligence that could compromise national security." Blackwood snapped the first crack in his composed demeanor. "Langston is a traitor to her country." "Is she?" Will held the colonel's gaze. "Or just to your railroad's profits?" Blackwood's expression hardened. "You fought for the Union, Sergeant, took an oath to defend this nation. Now you harbor an enemy of that same country. I expected better from a decorated veteran." "I took an oath to defend the Constitution," Will countered, "not railroad expansion. They're one and the same. This nation's future depends on binding east to west with steel rails. Those who obstruct progress are enemies of America itself." Blackwood stepped closer, his fanaticism evident now. The documents Langston stole contain sensitive negotiations with Indian tribes' land acquisitions vital to national security. Their exposure could set the frontier aflame with renewed violence. Will recognized the rhetorical strategy wrapping corporate greed in the flag-casting opposition as treason. He'd heard similar justifications during the war for actions that had nothing to do with preserving the Union. If these documents are so dangerous, he said carefully, why not involve federal marshals? Why a private railroad militia? A flicker of something caution perhaps crossed Blackwood's face. The situation requires discretion to prevent panic. Or scrutiny, Will suggested. Blackwood's patience visibly thinned. Enough debate, Sergeant. My offer stands for 5 minutes more. Tell me where Langston is hiding or your homestead burns, your daughter with it. The mention of Rose ignited fury in Will's chest, but he contained it, channeling it instead into heightened awareness. Blackwood stood confident, but slightly off balance on the uneven ground. The colonel's left boot had sunk deeper in the snow, restricting quick movement. Most importantly, clouds now obscured the sun, casting the clearing into premature twilight conditions that favored Will's next move. The woman you're looking for, Will said slowly, arrived during the blizzard, half frozen with a bullet wound in her neck. He shifted his weight subtly, preparing. She couldn't remember her own name, but last night she started talking in her sleep. Blackwood leaned forward, slightly interest overriding caution. What did she say? Something about a station. A key. Will glanced deliberately past Blackwood's shoulder, as if seeing movement in the trees behind him. And a name. Yours. The colonel instinctively began to turn, responding to the suggested threat at his back. The oldest trick in combat, but effective even against experienced opponents when properly executed. Will moved the instant Blackwood's attention wavered. He drove forward, crossing the distance between them in 3 powerful strides, throwing his entire weight into a tackle that sent them both crashing into the snow. The Remington discharged harmlessly into the air as they fell. Blackwood fought with the desperate strength of a man who knew the cost of failure. He was older than Will, but powerfully built, with the wiry toughness of a career soldier. They rolled through the snow, grappling for control of the revolver, breath coming in harsh gasps that frosted the air between them. Will managed to pin Blackwood, briefly landing a solid blow to the older man's jaw. But the colonel bucked upward, dislodging him, then drove a knee into Will's side with enough force to crack ribs. Pain lanced through Will's torso as Blackwood scrambled to bring the Remington to bear. Desperation lent Will strength. He seized Blackwood's wrist, smashing it against the frozen ground until the revolver tumbled from numbed fingers. Both men lunged for the weapon. Will reached it, first fingers closing around the cold metal as Blackwood drove a fist into his wounded side. Agony nearly cost Will consciousness. His vision narrowed to a tunnel darkness encroaching at the edges. Through sheer will, he managed to bring the revolver up, pressing it against Blackwood's chest. Enough! Will gasped, each breath sending shards of pain through his ribs. It's over. Blackwood went still, his face inches from Will's hatred burning in his eyes. You're making a mistake, Sergeant. Siding with a traitor against your own country. Maybe. Will struggled to his feet, keeping the Remington trained on Blackwood. But I've seen what men like you call progress graves, from Virginia to Missouri, filled with boys who died for causes that weren't what they seemed. He backed toward his discarded weapons. Now we're going to walk to my homestead. You'll call off your men, and then we'll discuss terms. Blackwood's laugh was unexpected, a harsh sound that echoed in the winter silence. You think this ends with negotiation? The Continental Railroad doesn't negotiate with thieves and squatters. Then I'll take my chances with the territorial governor, Will replied, retrieving his rifle while keeping the revolver aimed at Blackwood. I'm sure he'd be interested in your methods. The governor signed the railroad's charter himself, Blackwood sneered. He understands what's at stake. One homesteader and a fugitive won't even merit his attention. Will's expression hardened. On your feet, Colonel. We're leaving. Blackwood rose slowly, brushing snow from his coat with deliberate movements. You've chosen the wrong side, Wren. The railroad is the future. Men like you clinging to individual plots while the nation demands unity are relics, obsolete as cavalry against Gatling guns. Maybe, Will acknowledged, gesturing with the revolver for Blackwood to start walking. But relics like me still know how to fight. They began the trek toward Will's homestead, Blackwood leading Will, following 3 paces behind, revolver ready. The colonel moved with the stiff dignity of a man unaccustomed to defeat, while Will fought to conceal the pain radiating from his injured ribs with each labored breath. Snow began to fall as they walked, gentle at first, then heavier, reducing visibility to a few dozen yards. The forest closed around them, ancient pines indifferent to human conflicts waged beneath their boughs. In the gathering dusk, shadows deepened, transforming familiar terrain into something otherworldly and treacherous. Your men, Will said, after they'd covered nearly a mile. How many are watching my cabin? Blackwood continued walking, not bothering to look back. Enough! Names, Will insisted. I want to know who I'm dealing with. A pause, then, Bradford and Sullivan from yesterday, plus Haggerty and Nash, all former military, all excellent marksmen. 4 men, professional gunmen with military training. The odds were worse than Will had feared. And their orders if you don't return. As I said, Blackwood replied coldly. Burn it all. Leave no witnesses. Will absorbed this, adjusting his mental calculations. Even if they reached the cabin without incident, even if Blackwood ordered his men to stand down, the colonel couldn't be trusted. Men like Blackwood didn't surrender power easily, and Will had humiliated him. Revenge would follow whether today or tomorrow. Your railroad, Will said, changing tactics. It's planning a spur line through the high country through my land. The northern route, Blackwood confirmed, connecting the main line to mining operations in North Park. Your homestead sits on the only viable pass through the Continental Divide in that section. Will had suspected as much when he filed his claim 5 years ago. The pass had been a natural travel corridor since before white settlement, used first by native tribes, then by fur trappers and early pioneers. Eventually the railroad would come, he'd known that. But he'd hoped for more time. Time to establish his claim beyond dispute. Time for Rose to grow up knowing the freedom of the mountains. So this isn't just about Mira and her documents, Will said. You want my land regardless. Blackwood's silence was confirmation enough. They continued through deepening snow, the temperature dropping precipitously as night approached. Will's side burned with each step, but he maintained the pace, knowing what awaited if they failed to reach the cabin before full dark death by exposure certain as sunrise. When they were within a half-mile of the homestead, Blackwood suddenly stopped. Listen carefully, Sergeant, he said without turning. We're approaching the perimeter my men established. Unless you want bullets flying, you'll need to signal them. Will's grip tightened on the revolver. What signal? 3 short whistles followed by 2 long. Otherwise, they'll assume I'm under duress and act accordingly. The dilemma was obvious. If Will forced Blackwood to signal, the colonel could easily modify it to alert his men to the situation. If Will whistled himself, Blackwood's men might shoot him on sight as an unknown threat. You'll whistle exactly as described, Will decided. Any deviation and you die first. Blackwood nodded once. Understood. They resumed walking the homestead, now visible through the trees, lamplight glowing in the cabin windows, smoke rising from the chimney into the snowy twilight. The scene's tranquility belied the deadly threat surrounding it. At the forest edge, Blackwood stopped again. He brought his fingers to his lips and produced the signal, 3 short whistles, too long. The sound carried clearly through the still air. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then, an answering whistle came from the darkness to their right. "Walk forward slowly," Blackwood instructed. "My men will reveal themselves." Will kept the revolver pressed against Blackwood's back as they emerged from the tree line. Almost immediately, 4 shadows detached themselves from various positions around the clearing, 2 from behind the barn, 1 from beside the woodpile, another from behind a snowdrift 30 yards from the cabin door. All held rifles at the ready. "Colonel," called one of the men, Bradford Will thought, recognizing the barrel-chested figure from Summit Junction. "Stand down!" Blackwood ordered, his voice carrying authority despite his position. "Sergeant Wren and I have reached an understanding." The men lowered their rifles slightly, but remained wary, clearly noting the revolver in Will's hand. Inside, Will directed, guiding Blackwood toward the cabin. They crossed the open ground slowly, Will acutely aware of the 4 rifles that could end his life at any moment. The snow continued falling, transforming the scene into a ghostly tableau of black and white, the only color the golden glow from the cabin windows where he hoped Mira had kept Rose safe. As they neared the door, Will called out, "Mira, it's Will. I'm coming in with company." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the bar scraped back, and the door opened a few inches. Mira's green eyes peered through the gap, widening when she saw Blackwood. "Let us in," Will said, his voice strained from pain and cold. "Quickly." She opened the door fully, Colt revolver raised and aimed steadily at Blackwood's chest. Her expression was transformed. Gone was any trace of the uncertain, amnesia-plagued woman of days past. In her place stood someone harder, more focused, a soldier. "Colonel," she said, her voice cold as the surrounding mountains. "Langston." Blackwood's tone held equal frost. "Still alive, I see." "No thanks to you." She stepped back, allowing them entry but keeping the revolver trained on Blackwood. "Rose is in the root cellar," she told Will. "Safe." Will nodded gratefully, directing Blackwood to a chair at the table while keeping the Remington leveled at him. Once the colonel was seated, Will finally allowed himself to lean against the wall, his free hand pressing against his injured side. "You're hurt," Mira observed, concern briefly replacing vigilance. "Cracked ribs. Nothing fatal." Will nodded toward the window. "His men are outside, 4 of them all armed." Mira's expression tightened. "I counted them earlier. They've had the cabin surrounded since midday." "And you didn't run," Blackwood interjected, studying her with cold calculation. "The back window was unobserved for at least an hour. You could have escaped through the forest." "And leave the child," Mira's voice held contempt. "That's the difference between us, Colonel. Always has been." Blackwood leaned back in the chair, a dangerous smile playing beneath his silver beard. "Oh, I think there are many differences between us, Langston. Loyalty, for one. Duty. Understanding what's truly at stake." "I know exactly what's at stake," she replied. "I've seen the orders you drafted, the regrettable casualties you authorized to secure the northern route." "Progress demands sacrifice," Blackwood stated flatly. "The Transcontinental Railroad cost thousands of lives, workers, soldiers, settlers, but it united a nation. The Northern Spur will open resources vital to our industrial future." "At the cost of how many Ute lives?" Mira challenged. "How many homesteaders like the Wrens? Acceptable losses," Blackwood dismissed. balanced against national interest. Will pushed himself upright, fighting through the pain in his side. There's nothing national about your interest, Colonel. It's corporate profit dressed up as patriotism. Blackwood regarded him with something like pity. You fought for the Union sergeant. Did you imagine that victory meant nothing would change? That the nation you bled for wouldn't need to grow to industrialize, to connect its vast territories with steel and steam? He shook his head. The war never ended. It merely transformed. Now we fight for America's future against different enemies, those who would keep us divided, isolated, weak. And anyone in the railroad's path becomes an enemy by definition, Will concluded. Progress designates its own opponents, Blackwood agreed. History does not preserve those who stand against its tide. The Colonel's certainty was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his character, Will realized. Blackwood truly believed in his cause, saw himself as a patriot rather than a corporate enforcer. Such conviction made him far more dangerous than a simple mercenary. Mira had moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. "Your men are getting restless, Colonel," she observed. "They'll come looking for you soon." "Indeed." Blackwood's composure remained unruffled. "Which brings us to the practical matter at hand. You have something that belongs to the Continental Railroad. I want it back." "The documents aren't here," Mira stated flatly. "But you know where they are." She hesitated, and Will caught the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Despite her recovered memories, there were still gaps, crucial ones. "You remember fragments," Blackwood surmised, watching her closely. "The key, the station, but not precisely where you hid them." His smile widened. "How inconvenient!" "I remember enough," Mira countered. "Enough to know what you're planning. Enough to stop it." Blackwood laughed softly. "With what leverage, Langston, look at your position. Trapped in a remote cabin. Surrounded by my men. Your only ally injured and outgunned." He leaned forward. "Even if you kill me, Bradford has orders. This ends only one way." Will exchanged glances with Mira, seeing his own calculations reflected in her eyes. Blackwood was right about their tactical position. Even if they managed to neutralize the Colonel, his men outside held every advantage. "There's always negotiation," Will suggested, playing for time. "The documents in exchange for our safety. Our lives for your secrets." "An intriguing proposal," Blackwood acknowledged, "but it assumes equal value on both sides of the exchange. Your lives mean nothing to the Continental Railroad. The documents, however, could cost millions in contracts, land rights, political capital." "And your life?" Mira asked quietly. "What is that worth to the railroad?" Blackwood's expression hardened. "Don't threaten what you can't deliver, Langston. You're not a killer. Never were. It's why you failed as an operative. Too much conscience, too little resolve." "People change," she replied, her grip tightening on the Colt. "A bullet in the neck tends to clarify one's principles." The tension in the cabin thickened, time suspended between heartbeats as Mira and Blackwood locked gazes in silent confrontation. Will watched them both, recognizing the history between them, mentor and protege trust, and betrayal ideology turned to disillusionment. The moment shattered at a sharp rap on the door. "Colonel," Bradford's voice called. "Everything all right in there?" Blackwood's eyes never left Mira's. "Fine, Bradford," he responded smoothly. "The sergeant and I are having a productive conversation. Stand by." "Yes, sir." When the footsteps receded, Blackwood spread his hands in a gesture of apparent reasonableness. "Let's be practical. You're outnumbered, outgunned. Even if you somehow overcame my men, the Continental Railroad would simply send more. This isn't a battle you can win through force. What do you propose? Will asked, sensing a shift in the colonel's strategy. A compromise. Langston tells me where the documents are hidden. In return, I guarantee your homestead remains untouched. No spur line through your property, no review of your claim. Blackwood nodded toward the loft. Your daughter grows up in the home you built. The Continental Railroad finds another route. The offer hung in the air, tempting in its simplicity. Will's land and Rose's future secured with a few words from Mira. All it would cost was whatever lay hidden in those documents and whatever lives Blackwood's plans would eventually claim. And what happens to Mira? Will asked. Blackwood's expression revealed nothing. She comes with me, faces internal discipline from the company for theft of proprietary materials. He held up a hand as Will began to protest. Not death, Sergeant. Despite what Langston may have told you, we're not murderers. She'll be detained at company headquarters until the northern spur is completed, then released. With no memory of what was in those documents, Mira added bitterly. After one of your special interrogations, I imagine. Professional amnesia is sometimes a blessing, Langston. You should know. Will's mind raced, evaluating options, searching for alternatives. Outside, Blackwood's men waited. Inside, Rose huddled in the root cellar, her future hanging on decisions made in the next few minutes. And beside him stood Mira, no longer a stranger from the storm, but someone whose fate had become inexplicably entwined with his own. I need to speak with Mira, Will said finally. Alone, Blackwood chuckled. So you can coordinate some desperate last stand? I think not. So I can consider your offer, Will countered. 5 minutes, that's all. The colonel studied him, then nodded. Very well, 5 minutes. He glanced at the heavy iron stove across the room. But I'll need to be restrained, for your peace of mind. Will hesitated, suspecting a trap, but Blackwood's reasoning made sense. The colonel was calculating enough to know when temporary cooperation served his interests. They secured Blackwood to the cast-iron stove with rope from Will's pack, tight enough to hold him, but not to cause injury. The colonel submitted to the binding with the stoic dignity of a man who considered such physical constraints beneath his concern. When they were certain he couldn't overhear, Will drew Mira to the far corner of the cabin. We need options, he said quietly. Fast. Mira nodded, her expression grim. His men won't wait much longer. And he's right about one thing. Even if we somehow survive tonight, the railroad would just send more men. You believe his offer about leaving my homestead alone? No. Her response was immediate. Blackwood says whatever serves his immediate purpose. The moment he has those documents, we become liabilities to eliminate. Will had reached the same conclusion. Then we need leverage. Something to keep us alive after he gets what he wants. Mira's gaze drifted to her small leather pouch on the table where the brass key gleamed in the lamplight. The key, she murmured. It's been right in front of me all along. You remember where the documents are? Not exactly, but I remember what they're in. Her eyes lit with sudden clarity. A duplicate. I made a duplicate set before I ran. Will leaned closer. Where? Summit Junction, station master's office. There's a row of strong boxes for passengers' valuables. Her words came faster now as memory cascaded. Box 17. The key fits it. I paid for 6 months' storage under a false name. What good does that do us now? Summit Junction is 15 miles away. Mira's expression hardened with resolve. It means Blackwood can have the original documents. But if anything happens to us, The duplicates go to the territorial governor, the Denver Post, and the Department of the Interior. Will understood immediately. Insurance. Exactly. She glanced toward Blackwood, who sat watching them with predatory patience. But he needs to believe we've hidden the duplicates somewhere he can't reach them. Somewhere that ensures our safety as long as we're alive. It was a desperate gambit founded on bluff and Blackwood's calculating nature. If the colonel believed killing them would result in his plans being exposed, he might let them live. It's thin, Will admitted. It's all we have, Mira replied. Before they could discuss further, a sharp whistle came from outside, a signal from one of Blackwood's men. The colonel straightened, suddenly alert. "Time's up," he called to them. "Bradford's patience is exhausted. Decide now, or he'll decide for you." Will and Mira exchanged one final glance, a moment of silent communication between two people who days ago had been strangers. Now they stood together against forces that threatened everything they valued. "We have your documents, Colonel," Mira announced, turning to face Blackwood. "And we're prepared to return them, but only under conditions that ensure our survival." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "I'm listening." "First," she said, her voice steady, despite the stakes, "Will Wren's homestead remains untouched, permanently. The railroad finds another route for its northern spur. Costly, but potentially manageable," Blackwood allowed. "Continue." "Second, we both receive signed guarantees of immunity. No pursuit, no retribution, no accidents after you've gotten what you want. The Continental Railroad can arrange appropriate legal assurances. And third," Mira continued, "you should know that insurance exists. Copies of every document, every order, every map secured where your men can't reach them. If anything happens to either of us, those copies go public immediately." Blackwood's composure faltered for the first time. "You're bluffing, Langston. There wasn't time to duplicate everything. I began copying your orders the day I discovered what you were planning," she countered. 3 weeks before I ran. More than enough time." Will watched the colonel's face, recognizing the rapid calculations occurring behind those cold eyes. Blackwood was weighing probabilities, assessing risks, determining whether Mira's claim was credible. "Prove it," Blackwood demanded finally. "Show me evidence these supposed copies exist." "The brass key," Mira replied, nodding toward her pouch. "Summit Junction Station, Strongbox 17. Something like genuine alarm flickered across Blackwood's features, quickly masked but unmistakable. He recognized the location, knew it was plausible. "Even if I believe you," the colonel said carefully, "what prevents me from simply seizing this strongbox once I have the originals, because the contents aren't there anymore?" Will interjected, following Mira's strategy. "We have associates who moved them to a secure location days ago. People who have instructions to release everything if we don't confirm our safety regularly." It was a complete fabrication, but delivered with the conviction of truth. Will held Blackwood's gaze, steadily revealing nothing. For a long moment, the cabin was silent, save for the crackling of the fire. Outside, snow continued falling, muffling the world in white. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called a lonely sound that emphasized the isolation of their confrontation. Then Blackwood laughed, a genuine sound of reluctant appreciation. "Well played, Langston," he said, shaking his head. "You always were my most promising student. Too clever by half." He sighed. "Very well. I accept your terms with one amendment. You will accompany me to retrieve the original documents. Insurance for my insurance, as it were." Mira tensed. "Both of us. Just you," Blackwood clarified. "Sergeant Wren and his daughter remain here as our mutual guarantee. My men watch them. Nothing happens to them as long as you and I return with the documents. After that, we all go our separate ways." Will exchanged glances with Mira, seeing the trap hidden within Blackwood's counteroffer. If Mira left with the colonel, there was no guarantee she would return alive. Yet if she refused, they had no leverage to prevent immediate action from the men outside. "I'll go," Mira decided before Will could object. "On one condition, your men withdraw to the forest perimeter. They don't enter the cabin, don't approach Will or Rose under any circumstances." Blackwood considered this, then nodded. "Acceptable." Will stepped closer to Mira, lowering his voice. "This is too dangerous. He'll kill you once he has the documents." "Not if he believes the insurance is real," she whispered back. "And I need to confirm something at Summit Junction, something that might change everything." "What?" Her eyes held a fierce determination that hadn't been there before. "Trust me, Will, please." Before he could respond, another sharp whistle came from outside, more urgent this time. "Decide now," Blackwood ordered. "My men are not known for their patience." Mira straightened, decision made. "I'll get my coat." As she gathered her things, Will moved to untie Blackwood from the stove. The colonel rose, rubbing circulation back into his wrists, his expression unreadable. "A wise choice, Sergeant," he said quietly. "For your daughter's sake." "If she's harmed," Will replied, voice equally low, "nothing will stop me from finding you. Nothing." Blackwood studied him for a moment, perhaps recognizing the absolute truth in the statement. "I believe you," he acknowledged, "but it won't come to that. Business is business. Once I have what I need, this unpleasantness ends." Mira returned wearing her cloak, the brass key secured in her pocket. Her face was composed, revealing nothing of her thoughts or fears. "I'll need a horse," she told Blackwood. "Bradford will provide one." The colonel moved to the door, then paused. "One more thing, Langston. If this is some elaborate deception, if those documents aren't where you claim our agreement is void, remember that." "The documents exist, Colonel," she replied steadily. "Whether you'll like what they contain is another matter." Blackwood opened the door, allowing a swirl of snow and cold air into the cabin. Outside, his men had emerged from cover rifles, ready faces obscured by scarves against the bitter night. "Bradford," the colonel called, "prepare 2 horses. Miss Langston and I are riding to Summit Junction." He issued rapid orders directing his men to maintain positions at the forest perimeter, watching the cabin, but not approaching. Will stood in the doorway as Mira prepared to leave, their eyes meeting in a silent exchange laden with everything they couldn't say aloud. She reached out suddenly, squeezing his hand. "Keep Rose safe," she whispered. "I'll return by dawn." "You'd better," he replied, his voice rough with emotions he hadn't expected to feel for this woman who had appeared in a blizzard less than a week ago. Then she was gone, mounting the horse Bradford had brought forward, riding into the snowy darkness beside Blackwood. Will watched until they disappeared into the swirling white, a hollow feeling expanding in his chest that had nothing to do with his injured ribs. He closed the door against the storm, barring it securely, then moved to the trap door hidden beneath the rug. "Rose," he called softly, "you can come out now. It's safe." His daughter emerged from the root cellar, pale but composed. She climbed into his arms without a word, burying her face against his shoulder. "Where's Miss Mira going?" she asked finally, her voice small in the quiet cabin. Will held her close, staring at the fire, calculating distances and time, formulating a plan, even as he comforted his child. "To fix things," he answered. "But we're going to help her." Because one thing had become absolutely clear to Will Wren as he watched Mira ride away with Blackwood: whatever was hidden in Summit Junction was worth killing for. and the colonel had no intention of letting Mira Langston return alive. Will Wren had never intended to involve his daughter in this dangerous game of survival. But as he studied the cabin's defenses, calculating odds against Blackwood's men, he realized Rose was already involved, had been since the moment Mira collapsed at their door during the blizzard. "Papa," Rose's small voice broke his contemplation, "are the bad men going to hurt Miss Mira?" Will knelt beside her, meeting her eyes directly. In his 4 years as a father, he had never lied to his daughter. He wouldn't start now even to comfort her. "They might try," he said gently. "But Miss Mira is very smart and very brave, and we're going to help her." Rose nodded solemnly. "Like in the stories Mama used to tell about the knights who rescue people." A pang shot through Will's chest at the mention of Elizabeth. Before the avalanche took her, his wife had filled Rose's head with tales of chivalry and courage, stories Will had considered fanciful but harmless. Now he wondered if Elizabeth had been preparing their daughter for a world harsher than he'd wanted to acknowledge. "Something like that," he agreed. "But first we need to be clever. Like foxes." Rose's expression brightened at the familiar reference. During hunting trips, Will had taught her about the fox's cunning, how it created false trails, used terrain to its advantage, and never confronted stronger predators directly. "I can be clever," she assured him. "I know you can." Will rose, checking his Winchester's action. "Now, listen carefully. We're going to play a special game." While explaining his plan in terms a 4-year-old could understand, Will moved methodically around the cabin, gathering essentials, ammunition, food, medical supplies, warm clothing. His cracked ribs protested with each movement, but he pushed through the pain, knowing what was at stake. Outside, Blackwood's men maintained their perimeter watch. Will had spotted their positions earlier, 2 near the barn, one by the large pine at the forest edge, another circling between points. Professional spacing covering all approaches. They expected any threat to come from outside, not from within the cabin itself. That miscalculation would be their first advantage. Will's homestead had been built with Colorado's brutal winters in mind. The cabin featured a root cellar for food storage accessible through the trap door beneath the rug. But there was another feature Elizabeth had insisted upon, one that had proven its worth during blizzards when the main door was snowbound: an escape tunnel. Running from the back of the root cellar, the narrow passage extended 20 yards, emerging behind a false boulder near the creek bed. In winter, with snow piled high, the tunnel's exit would be concealed beneath drifts, invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. "Remember how we used the special door last winter?" Will asked Rose. "When the snow was too high," she nodded eagerly. "The rabbit hole Mama showed me." "That's right." Will checked his pocket watch. 9:30. Blackwood and Mira had departed an hour ago. The round trip to Summit Junction would take at least 6 hours, in good conditions longer in tonight's snowfall. That gave him a narrow window to execute his plan. "We're going to use the rabbit hole tonight, and we need to be very quiet, like mice." Rose's eyes widened with understanding, and she mimed, zipping her lips closed. Will smiled despite the gravity of their situation. Even in crisis, children possessed a remarkable ability to find adventure where adults saw only danger. He doused all lamps save one, creating the impression that the cabin's occupants had retired for the night. Then, moving with deliberate quiet, he and Rose cleared the trap door and descended into the root cellar. The tunnel entrance was disguised as a storage cabinet against the earthen wall. Will swung it open, revealing a passage barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, supported by timber frames every few feet. The air within was cold and damp, smelling of soil and pine resin. "I'll go first," he whispered to Rose. "Stay right behind me. If I tell you to stop, freeze immediately." Understand?" She nodded, her expression serious beyond her years. Will lit a small bullseye lantern, shielding most of its light to avoid detection. Then he entered the tunnel, crawling on hands and knees, his Winchester pushed ahead of him. Rose followed, moving with surprising stealth for a child her age. The passage seemed narrower than Will remembered, his shoulders occasionally brushing against the rough-hewn supports. His injured ribs screamed with each movement, but he maintained a steady pace, counting the support beams to track their progress. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only minutes, they reached the tunnel's end. A heavy wooden panel reinforced with iron bands sealed the exit. Will pressed his ear against it, listening for any sound that might indicate one of Blackwood's men had discovered their escape route. Nothing but the muffled whisper of falling snow. "Stay here," he breathed to Rose. "I'll check if it's safe." Will eased the panel open just enough to peer outside. The night was a tableau of white and black snow continuing to fall, steadily accumulating on the pine boughs, overhead drifts deepening across the clearing. Through swirling flakes, he could make out the dark silhouette of his cabin 40 yards away, a single lamp still glowing in its window. More importantly, he could see two of Blackwood's men, shadowy figures positioned at the forest edge, focused on watching the cabin. Neither was looking in his direction. Will closed the panel and turned to Rose. "Remember our game plan?" he whispered. "You'll stay hidden in our special place while I help Miss Mira. Don't come out until you hear our special whistle." 3 short, 2 long, Rose recited dutifully. "That's my girl." Will embraced her briefly, feeling her small heart beating against his chest. "And if strangers come, run to Mr. Turner's place," she answered, naming their nearest neighbor, a former Union cavalry officer whose homestead lay 4 miles southwest. "Don't stop for anything." Will nodded, throat tight with emotion he couldn't afford to indulge. "I'll come back for you. No matter what happens, I'll come back." Rose looked up at him with complete trust, the same expression Elizabeth had worn when he'd promised to build her a home in this mountain wilderness. A promise he'd kept, though she hadn't lived to see it completed. This promise to Rose he would keep or die trying. Their special place was a hollow beneath a lightning-struck pine 30 yards from the tunnel exit. Will had reinforced it years ago as an emergency shelter, stocking it with blankets, food, and water. Rose knew it well from their game of mountain survival, what Will had presented as play, but had actually been preparation for exactly this type of situation. "Ready?" he asked. Rose nodded, her face solemn in the lantern's dim glow. Will eased the panel open again, scanning the surroundings once more before motioning Rose forward. They emerged into the snowy night, immediately dropping low to minimize their silhouettes. The snow provided both challenge and advantage. It made movement more difficult, but muffled sound and obscured visibility. They crept toward the hollow pine, Will constantly scanning for Blackwood's men. The falling snow had intensified, reducing visibility to less than 50 yards, a blessing under the circumstances. When they reached the hollow, Will quickly helped Rose inside, ensuring the cached blankets were wrapped securely around her small form. "I won't be long," he promised, knowing it might be a lie. "Remember the signal." 3 short, 2 long, she repeated, her breath fogging in the cold air. "Be careful, Papa." Will pressed a kiss to her forehead, then sealed the hollow's entrance with branches and snow, leaving just enough space for air circulation. To casual observation, it would appear as nothing more than a snow-covered deadfall. Now alone, Will turned his attention to the most dangerous part of his plan, neutralizing Blackwood's men without alerting them to his presence. Any gunfire would echo across the valley, potentially endangering Mira at Summit Junction. He needed stealth, not firepower. He circled wide around the cabin, staying within the tree line, using his intimate knowledge of the terrain to approach the first sentry position. Bradford, the barrel-chested man from town, stood beneath a massive spruce, intermittently stamping his feet against the cold while maintaining vigilance on the cabin. Will moved closer, each step calculated to avoid breaking twigs or disturbing snow-laden branches. His cavalry training had included scout work, silent movement through enemy territory, neutralizing pickets, creating openings for the main force to exploit. Skills he'd hoped never to use again after the war, now employed to protect what he loved. 20 feet from Bradford, Will deliberately snapped a small branch underfoot. The sound, though slight, carried in the winter stillness. Bradford tensed, rifle raising slightly, as he peered into the darkness. "Sullivan," he called softly. "That you?" Will remained motionless, letting the falling snow obscure his outline against the trees. After a moment's hesitation, Bradford stepped away from his position, moving cautiously toward the sound. Exactly as Will had anticipated. Most men, when confronted with potential danger in darkness, instinctively move toward it, seeking to confirm or eliminate the threat, rather than maintain defensive posture. Will circled silently, positioning himself behind Bradford's path. When the man was 10 feet from the trees, squinting into the darkness, Will struck. The blow from his rifle butt caught Bradford at the base of his skull, delivered with precision enough force to render unconscious without causing permanent damage. The larger man crumpled into the snow without a sound. Will quickly secured Bradford with rope from his pack, gagging him with a bandana, in case he regained consciousness prematurely. 1 down, 3 to go. The next sentry, Sullivan, proved more challenging. Positioned behind the woodpile with clear sight lines to both the cabin's front door and Bradford's post, the lean gunman maintained better discipline, scanning his surroundings methodically rather than fixating on the cabin alone. Will studied him for several minutes, assessing patterns, looking for weaknesses. Every man had them: moments of inattention, physical limitations, environmental blind spots. Sullivan's came in the form of a persistent cough, likely from years of tobacco use. Each time he coughed, he momentarily closed his eyes, breaking his vigilance for crucial seconds. Will waited patiently, timing his approach to coincide with these brief vulnerabilities. Moving in stages, freezing when Sullivan's attention swept his direction, advancing when the cough provided cover. The final approach required perfect timing. Will gathered himself as Sullivan's breathing hitched, signaling another coughing spell. The instant the man's eyes closed, Will launched forward, crossing the final distance in 3 rapid strides. Sullivan sensed the attack too late. His eyes widened in alarm, hand moving toward his holstered revolver. Will drove his shoulder into the man's midsection, using his own momentum to carry them both behind the woodpile, out of sight from the remaining sentries. They grappled silently in the snow, Sullivan fighting with desperate intensity, Will hampered by his injured ribs. The pain nearly blinded him when Sullivan landed a solid blow to his side, but he channeled it, converting agony to focused rage. The struggle ended abruptly when Will managed to slam Sullivan's head against a log. The man went limp immediately. Will bound him quickly, dragging both unconscious sentries behind the woodpile where they wouldn't be discovered easily. 2 down. 2 remained. Will paused to catch his breath, each inhalation sending shards of pain through his side. He suspected at least 1 rib was fully broken now, not merely cracked. The metallic taste of blood in his mouth confirmed internal damage. A problem for later if he survived the night. Locating the 3rd sentry proved more difficult. The man Haggerty, based on Blackwood's earlier comments, was maintaining mobile patrol, circling the perimeter at irregular intervals. Professional, cautious, military background evident in his movement patterns. Will tracked him through the falling snow, noting his route, calculating intercept points. Unlike the others, this man would require distraction rather than direct approach. Retreating temporarily, Will gathered pine cones and small stones from beneath a sheltering tree. Then, positioning himself where he could observe Haggerty's patrol route, he waited for the sentry to reach the furthest point from the cabin. When Haggerty was momentarily obscured by a stand of young pines, Will lobbed a pine cone high into a distant tree. The resulting shower of snow and the soft thump as it landed drew Haggerty's immediate attention. The sentry paused, rifle raised, staring toward the disturbance. Will sent another projectile in the same direction, reinforcing the impression of movement in the forest. Haggerty advanced cautiously toward the sound, just as Will had hoped. Another distraction, another few steps forward. Each carefully calculated to draw the sentry away from his patrol route into territory Will had selected for ambush. When Haggerty passed beneath a snow-laden pine bough, Will sprang his trap. He yanked the rope he'd positioned earlier, shaking the branch violently. A cascade of heavy snow dropped directly onto Haggerty, momentarily blinding and disorienting him. Will struck before the man could recover, driving the rifle butt into the back of his knee. Haggerty collapsed with a muffled grunt, and Will was on him, instantly delivering a precise blow to the temple that ended the struggle before it truly began. 3 down. 1 remained Nash, the youngest of Blackwood's men, positioned near the barn. Will's body screamed for rest. Blood soaked his shirt beneath his coat. His breathing had grown labored, and exhaustion dragged at his limbs. But time was running critically short. By now, Blackwood and Mira would be nearing Summit Junction. Whatever awaited her there, Will needed to arrive before irreversible decisions were made. He approached the barn from its blind side, using the structure itself as cover. Nash stood at the corner nearest the cabin, alternating between watching the house and scanning the surrounding forest. Unlike his companions, he appeared nervous, shifting his weight frequently, rifle clutched too tightly. Inexperienced, dangerous in his unpredictability. Will considered his options, discarding direct approach as too risky with this jumpy sentry. Instead, he retrieved his hunting knife from his boot, the weapon of last resort, one he'd hoped never to use against a human target again after the war. Gathering snow into a compact ball, Will took careful aim, then threw it against the barn's far wall. The soft thump carried clearly in the night air. Nash spun toward the sound rifle leveled. "Who's there?" he called, voice cracking slightly. "Bradford Sullivan." Will remained motionless in the shadows. Nash advanced hesitantly toward the barn's entrance, checking behind him periodically, moving exactly as Will had anticipated, putting his back to Will's position. The approach was silent, the knife strike swift. Will's hand closed over Nash's mouth as the blade pressed against his throat, not cutting, merely threatening. "Don't move," Will whispered against the young man's ear. "Drop the rifle." Nash froze, then slowly released his weapon. It fell to the snow with a muffled thump. "Blackwood sent you to die for railroad profits," Will continued, his voice low and intense. "Is that worth your life?" The sentry trembled slightly, but remained silent. "I'm going to release you," Will told him. "You have 2 choices. Stay and fight for a man who considers you expendable, or walk away. Live to see morning." Will cautiously removed his hand from Nash's mouth knife still at his throat. "He'll kill me if I desert," Nash whispered, fear evident in his voice. "He'll have to find you first," Will countered. "There's a mining camp 3 valleys west. New operation, always hiring, no questions asked. You could be there by dawn if you start now." Seconds stretched as Nash weighed his options. Finally, he nodded almost imperceptibly. "Let me go." Will slowly withdrew the knife, stepping back but remaining ready if the man attempted deception. Nash turned his young face pale in the moonlight, eyes darting between Will and the fallen rifle. "It's not loaded," Will lied. "Insurance." Nash swallowed hard. "What happens now?" "You start walking west. I head to Summit Junction. We both might live through the night." After a moment's hesitation, Nash nodded again. "Blackwood plans to kill her, you know. The woman, once he has the documents, said she knows too much." "I know," Will acknowledged. "That's why I'm going after them." Nash studied him briefly, perhaps recognizing a determination that mirrored his own desire for survival. Then, without another word, he turned and melted into the snowy forest, heading west, as instructed. Will retrieved the fallen rifle, confirming it was indeed loaded, before slinging it over his shoulder alongside his Winchester. 4 sentries neutralized, 3 bound and unconscious, 1 persuaded to desert. The way to Summit Junction now clear. He moved quickly back to the hollow pine where Rose waited. Kneeling at the entrance, he whistled softly one short note. Their private signal that it was him approaching, not the promised all-clear pattern. Rose's small face appeared in the opening eyes, wide in the darkness.
"Papa, did you beat the bad men?" "For now," he confirmed. "But I need to go help Miss Mira. You remember what to do if I'm not back by morning?"
She nodded solemnly. "Go to Mr. Turner's place." Her small brow furrowed with concern. "But you will come back, right, with Miss Mira?" Will touched her cheek gently. "That's the plan, Rosie. But it might take longer than expected. If anyone comes who isn't me or Miss Mira, you run. Don't wait, don't look back. Promise me." "I promise," she whispered, her small voice steady, despite the fear she must surely feel. Will secured the hollow entrance again, ensuring Rose was protected from both discovery and the bitter cold. Then he made his final preparations for the journey to Summit Junction. The stable yielded his strongest horse, a bay gelding, named Sergeant, that had carried him through mountain storms and summer hunts with equal reliability. The animal snorted recognition as Will approached, stamping impatiently as he was saddled and bridled. Will mounted with difficulty, his injured side protesting sharply at the movement. Blood had soaked through his bandages, the metallic taste in his mouth more pronounced now. He knew the 15-mile ride ahead might kill him given his injuries, but the alternative, allowing Mira to face Blackwood alone, was unthinkable. As he guided Sergeant away from the homestead, Will cast one final glance back at the hollow pine where his daughter waited. Everything he had built over 5 years, the cabin, the barn, the future he'd imagined for Rose, all of it risked for a woman who had appeared in a blizzard less than a week ago. A woman who had somehow awakened his daughter's voice and his own long-dormant sense of purpose. Will turned Sergeant toward the trail and urged him into a canter. The large horse moved powerfully through the deepening snow, steam rising from his nostrils in the frigid air. Above them, the storm clouds had begun to break, revealing patches of star-strewn sky and a waning moon that cast ghostly light across the pristine landscape. 15 miles to Summit Junction. 15 miles of snow-choked trails, plunging temperatures, and the ever-present risk that Blackwood's men might recover consciousness and raise alarm. 15 miles with broken ribs, internal bleeding, and dwindling strength. Will settled into the saddle, finding the position that caused least pain, and focused on the rhythm of Sergeant's hooves breaking through the snow. Each stride carried him closer to Mira, closer to confrontation, closer to whatever truth lay hidden in Strongbox 17. The truth that Blackwood would kill to protect. Summit Junction emerged from the snowy darkness like a frontier outpost in a fever dream, a scattered collection of buildings clinging to civilization's edge, illuminated by scattered lanterns and the soft glow of windows. The railroad platform stood at its center,
a crude wooden structure that served as the settlement's reason for existence and tenuous connection to the wider world. Will approached cautiously, dismounting at the forest edge to lead Sergeant the final quarter-mile on foot. His body had settled into a state beyond ordinary pain during the punishing ride, a strange, detached awareness of injury without its full impact. He recognized the sensation from battlefield experiences, shock most likely holding the worst at bay until crisis passed. The station building stood dark and silent, no smoke rising from its chimney despite the bitter cold. Nearby, the saloon still showed signs of life. Yellow lamplight spilling from its windows, the occasional burst of laughter or raised voice suggesting business continued despite the late hour and worsening weather. Will scanned the buildings methodically, seeking any sign of Blackwood or Mira. Two horses stood outside the saloon, one bearing the distinctive Continental Railroad brand on its saddle blanket, Blackwood's mount. The other he recognized with a jolt of concern as the horse Bradford had provided for Mira. They were here, inside the saloon, most likely. Will secured Sergeant in the stable's shadow, then approached the saloon, cautiously keeping to the darkness between pools of lamplight. The building was typical frontier construction, rough-hewn logs, small windows, a single main entrance facing the street. Music from a badly tuned piano filtered through the walls, along with the murmur of conversations and occasional clink of glasses. Rather than risk the front entrance, Will circled to the rear, locating a small window that likely served the back storeroom. Standing on a discarded crate, he peered carefully inside. The window overlooked a narrow hallway leading to the main saloon area. A door stood partially open along one wall, revealing glimpses of what appeared to be a private room, perhaps reserved for card games requiring discretion. As Will watched, a shadow moved across the gap, the distinctive silhouette of Colonel Blackwood. The man's voice carried faintly, "Patience, wearing thin Langston. Where are the documents?" Will couldn't hear Mira's response, but Blackwood's irritated movements suggested it wasn't what he wanted to hear. The colonel paced back into view, gesturing sharply with one hand, the other resting near his holstered revolver. Will needed to get closer to understand what was happening before intervening. Lowering himself from the crate, he examined the building's rear entrance, a simple door secured with a basic lock. Child's play for anyone with military experience in forced entry. Using his hunting knife, Will manipulated the lock mechanism with practiced precision. The door opened with minimal sound, revealing a narrow storeroom stacked with barrels and crates. The smell of whiskey, tobacco, and lamp oil permeated the space. Moving silently between the stored goods, Will reached the hallway he'd observed from outside. The partially open door revealed more of the private room, now a round table, several chairs, a small sideboard with glasses and bottles. Blackwood stood with his back to the hallway, blocking Will's view of whoever else occupied the room. "I've indulged your games long enough," the colonel was saying, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You claimed the documents were in Strongbox 17. The station master confirmed no such box exists in his office." Mira's voice responded, frustratingly indistinct to Will's straining ears. Something about the station master lying about Blackwood checking himself. "Oh, I intend to," Blackwood replied, "with you leading the way. And if this proves another deception, our agreement regarding Sergeant Wren and his daughter becomes null and void. My men have standing orders in the event of my delayed return." Will tensed. Blackwood didn't know his men had been neutralized, which provided temporary advantage. But the colonel's threat was clear. If Mira didn't produce the documents soon, orders would be given to harm Rose. As Will prepared to move closer, a new voice entered the conversation, male unfamiliar, its tone deferential but urgent. "Excuse me, Colonel. Telegram from Denver headquarters, marked urgent." Blackwood turned slightly, revealing a thin man in railroad uniform holding out a yellow paper. The colonel took it impatiently, stepping aside to read its contents beneath the room's lamp. For the first time, Will caught clear sight of Mira. She sat at the table, hands folded before her, expression carefully neutral. No visible injuries, but her posture suggested tension, perhaps restraint. Her eyes, those remarkable green eyes, continuously scanned the room, evaluating options, seeking advantage. Those eyes widened suddenly when they locked with Will's through the partially open door. Recognition shocked, and something else flashed across her face, a complex emotion quickly masked as Blackwood turned back toward her. But in that brief connection, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement, a warning, perhaps a plan. Blackwood crumpled the telegram in his fist, face darkening with barely contained fury. "It seems," he said, voice dangerously soft, "that your insurance may indeed exist. Denver reports unauthorized document copies circulating among territorial officials." Mira's expression revealed nothing, though Will suspected this news was as surprising to her as to Blackwood. Someone else had created backup copies, whose time for games has ended. Blackwood continued, drawing his revolver with smooth efficiency. "We're going to the station now. You will open whatever strongbox contains those documents, or I'll put a bullet in your head and sort through the aftermath later." As the colonel gestured Mira to her feet, Will eased back into the storeroom shadows. Blackwood was taking her to the station, the very place Will needed them to go. Better to let them proceed, follow discreetly, and intervene when circumstances favored success. Through the storeroom's rear window, Will watched as Blackwood emerged from the saloon's front entrance, one hand gripping Mira's arm, the other holding his revolver partially concealed beneath his coat. They crossed the snowy street toward the darkened station building, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Will slipped out the rear door, circling wide to approach the station from its blind side. The building stood silent and dark, the station master presumably asleep in quarters above the ticket office. As Blackwood and Mira disappeared inside, Will positioned himself beneath a window, listening intently for voices that would guide his next move. Whatever secrets Strongbox 17 contained, whatever truth Mira had risked her life to protect, the moment of revelation was approaching, and with it, the deadliest confrontation of the night. Summit Junction's train station stood as a frontier outpost of Eastern civilization, a wooden structure more substantial than the surrounding buildings, representing the Continental Railroad's physical claim on the Colorado wilderness. By day, it processed passengers and freight connecting isolated mountain communities to Denver and beyond. By night, it slumbered dark and silent. Not tonight. Will Wren crouched beneath the station window, watching shadows move across the frost-covered glass. Inside, Blackwood forced Mira through the empty waiting room toward the station master's office at the building's far end. The colonel's revolver remained pressed against her back, a constant reminder of his lethal intentions. Will circled the building, seeking the optimal entry point. His military experience had taught him that rushed confrontations favored the better-positioned opponent, regardless of moral standing. Blackwood held every advantage inside the station, knowledge of what they sought, a hostage and unimpaired physical condition. Will's only edge was surprise. Once lost, he would have nothing. A side door used by railroad employees offered the most promising approach. Will tested it, gently locked as expected. Using his knife again, he manipulated the simple mechanism until it yielded with a soft click. He eased the door open just enough to slip inside, finding himself in a narrow corridor lined with wooden crates, awaiting morning shipment. Voices echoed from the station master's office ahead, Blackwood's commanding tone carrying clearly through the empty building. "Wake him," the colonel ordered. "Now." A sharp knock followed, then another more insistent. After several moments, a new voice joined the conversation, gruff, with interrupted sleep tinged with annoyance, quickly replaced by deference when Blackwood identified himself. "Colonel, sir, didn't expect railroad business at this hour." "This doesn't concern the railroad officially, Simmons," Blackwood replied. "It's a matter of national security. The woman claims you manage security boxes for passenger valuables." "Yes, sir, we do. Small service for travelers passing through." She specifically mentioned Strong Box 17. A pause. "17, sir? We don't. Our boxes only go to 12. Will inched closer, positioning himself where he could observe without being seen. The station master's office door stood partially open, revealing a small room dominated by a ticket counter and telegraph equipment. An older man in rumpled clothing, presumably Simmons, stood nervously adjusting suspenders over his nightshirt. Blackwood remained near the doorway, revolver now openly displayed. Mira stood between them, her expression revealing nothing. "The station master is lying, Colonel," she said calmly. "Box 17 exists. It's simply not in the public area." Simmons shook his head vigorously. "Ma'am, I don't know what you're referring to. We've only got 12 boxes, always have." "Show me," Blackwood demanded, gesturing with his revolver. Simmons led them to a wall behind the counter where a row of small metal doors was embedded in the wooden paneling. Each bore a number from 1 to 12. He unlocked a small panel revealing the interior mechanism. "See Colonel 1 through 12. That's all we have." Blackwood turned to Mira, eyes cold with dangerous impatience. "Your explanation." She maintained remarkable composure despite the weapon trained on her. "The passenger boxes are indeed numbered 1 through 12. But the Continental Railroad maintains separate secure storage for company documents and valuables." Her gaze fixed on Simmons. "Boxes 13 through 20, accessible only to authorized personnel, located beneath the floorboards in the station office." Color drained from Simmons's face, confirmation enough of her accuracy. I'm not authorized to access those without proper—" "Open it," Blackwood interrupted, revolver shifting toward the station master. "Box 17. Now." Simmons swallowed hard, glancing between the colonel and Mira. "Sir, those boxes are restricted to headquarters personnel with written authorization. My orders—" "Your orders come from me," Blackwood snapped. "Continental Railroad Executive Director. Unless you'd prefer explaining your obstruction to a military tribunal." The threat accomplished what reason couldn't. Simmons nodded jerkily, moving to the private office adjacent to the public counter area. Will shifted position, maintaining visual contact, as the station master knelt behind a large desk and rolled back a section of carpet, revealing a trap door built into the floor. "The company installed these when the line expanded 2 years ago," Simmons explained nervously as he produced a ring of keys from his desk drawer. "Secure storage for payrolls, land deeds, sensitive communications." Will watched intently as the station master unlocked and lifted the trapdoor, revealing a small cellar containing a row of metal strong boxes identical to those in the public area, but larger, each bearing a number from 13 to 20. Simmons located number 17, inserted another key, and stepped back as Blackwood gestured him away. "Open it," the colonel ordered Mira, revolver steady. Mira stepped forward, removing the brass key from her pocket. The key Will had seen among her few possessions when she arrived at his homestead. She knelt beside the open trap door, inserted the key into strongbox 17, and turned it with a decisive click. For a moment, no one moved. The office hung suspended in tense silence, broken only by the distant howl of wind across the mountain pass. Then Mira opened the strongbox lid. Inside lay a sealed oilskin packet, the kind used by military couriers to protect documents from weather and water damage. Blackwood's expression hardened with recognition. "Hand it to me," he commanded. "Carefully." Mira retrieved the packet but didn't immediately comply. "Our agreement first, Colonel. Written guarantees of safety for the Wrens. Confirmation that the railroad will bypass their homestead." Blackwood's laugh held no humor. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate, Langston." On the contrary, her voice remained steady. "The existence of duplicate documents circulating in Denver proves I prepared for this eventuality. Kill me, and those copies become public immediately. Your career, your railroad ambitions, your carefully constructed reputation, all destroyed." Will recognized the bluff for what it was, a desperate play to secure his and Rose's safety, even if Mira herself didn't survive the night. The telegram Blackwood had received suggested someone had indeed created duplicate documents, but Mira couldn't have known that when she fled 6 months ago. She was gambling everything on Blackwood's caution. The colonel studied her for a long moment, calculating odds and outcomes with the cold precision that had likely served him well in military intelligence. "Very well," he said finally. "Simmons, paper, and pen." The station master hurriedly produced writing materials from his desk. Blackwood drafted a brief document, signing it with his characteristic flourish, before handing it to Mira. "Satisfied?" he asked coldly. She scanned the contents. "This guarantees only that the Wren homestead will be considered for exemption from railroad acquisition. Not good enough, Colonel." "It's all you'll get," Blackwood replied, revolver emphasizing his point. "The packet. Now." Will tensed, recognizing the critical moment approaching. Blackwood had no intention of honoring any agreement once he secured those documents. The instant they changed hands, Mira's value as a hostage would expire. Mira seemed to realize this as well. She clutched the oilskin packet to her chest, taking a subtle half-step backward. "I want to verify the contents first. Ensure nothing has been disturbed." "Your delaying tactics are transparent, Langston." Blackwood's patience visibly thinned. "The documents. Final warning." Will shifted position, preparing to intervene. His Winchester stood ready, but using it meant killing Blackwood, an outcome that might bring the full weight of the Continental Railroad against his homestead in retribution. He needed another option. As if sensing his dilemma, Mira's eyes darted toward the office window, the same window where Will maintained his observation post. Their gazes met briefly, and in that moment, understanding passed between them. She had a plan. "Very well, Colonel," she said slowly, unwrapping the oilskin packet. "You leave me no choice." As the wrapping fell away, she revealed a stack of documents, maps, letters, and orders bearing official Continental Railroad letterhead. Blackwood extended his hand, anticipation evident in his expression. Instead of surrendering the papers, Mira suddenly lunged toward the desk, seizing the oil lamp that illuminated the office. In one fluid motion, she smashed it against the edge of the strongbox. Flames erupted instantly, fueled by spilled kerosene. Mira thrust the burning documents toward Blackwood, forcing him back as fire spread rapidly across the wooden desktop. "No!" Blackwood shouted, firing wildly as smoke filled the small office. Will crashed through the window in the same instant, glass shattering around him as he entered the chaos. His rifle butt caught Blackwood's arm, sending a second shot into the ceiling. Simmons dove for cover beneath the desk, as flames climbed the curtains, transforming the office into an inferno with shocking speed. "Run!" Will shouted to Mira, grappling with Blackwood for control of the revolver. She hesitated, clutching what appeared to be a single document salvaged from the burning stack. "Will, go," he commanded, driving Blackwood against the wall with desperate strength. The colonel fought with the fury of a man watching his ambitions literally go up in flames. Despite his age, he matched Will's strength, his military training evident in each calculated move. The revolver discharged again as they struggled, the bullet splintering wood inches from Will's head. Through smoke and spreading fire, Will glimpsed Mira fleeing the office, Simmons close behind. Good. Whatever happened now, she would survive to protect Rose if he didn't. Pain exploded through Will's injured side as Blackwood drove a knee into his ribs. The agony nearly cost him consciousness, darkness crowding his vision. He staggered, losing his grip on Blackwood's gun arm. The colonel leveled the revolver at Will's chest, victory gleaming in his eyes, despite the smoke billowing around them. "You chose the wrong side, Sergeant," he snarled. "Did I?" Will gasped, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "Look around you, Colonel. Your precious documents are ash. Your plans exposed. The railroad will disavow you to save itself." "The railroad is America's future," Blackwood insisted, flames reflecting in his eyes with zealot's intensity. "Men like you clinging to the past, to individual rights over national destiny, you're already ghosts." "Maybe," Will acknowledged, sensing movement behind Blackwood, "but ghosts have a way of haunting the living." Confusion flickered across Blackwood's face, replaced by shock, as a metal strongbox crashed against his skull from behind. The colonel crumpled instantly, revolver clattering to the floor. Mira stood over him, empty strongbox 17 still gripped in her hands, her expression grim. "We need to go," she said urgently. "The fire's spreading." Will nodded, retrieving Blackwood's revolver before allowing Mira to help him toward the shattered window. His strength was fading rapidly, internal injuries demanding their due after hours of desperate exertion. They stumbled out into the snowy night as flames engulfed the station master's office behind them. Already shouts of alarm rose from nearby buildings as Summit Junction's residents responded to the growing conflagration. "The horses!" Will gasped, leaning heavily against Mira. "Behind the saloon!" She guided him through deepening snow, supporting his weight as best she could. Blood stained his coat, now no longer hidden by darkness. Each breath produced a wet, rattling sound that spoke of serious internal damage. "You're hurt worse than you said," Mira observed, concern evident in her voice. "Doesn't matter," Will replied. "Rose. Need to get back to Rose." They reached the horses, Sergeant still waiting patiently, where Will had left him alongside Mira's mount from earlier. As Will struggled to lift himself into the saddle, his strength finally failed. He slumped against Sergeant's side, consciousness wavering. "Will?" Mira's voice seemed to come from a great distance. "Stay with me." He focused on her face, those remarkable green eyes, reflecting the distant flames, filled with determination and something else. Something he hadn't seen directed at him since Elizabeth. "The document," he managed. "The one you saved. What was it?" Mira hesitated, then produced a folded paper from inside her dress. "Blackwood's original order, authorizing the massacre of 3 Ute villages to manufacture a hostile incident, justifying military action." Her expression hardened. "Signed by him and countersigned by the railroad's board chairman. Proof of conspiracy at the highest level." "Worth dying for," Will murmured, darkness encroaching at the edges of his vision. "No one's dying tonight," Mira insisted. With surprising strength, she helped him mount Sergeant, then climbed up behind him, securing her arms around his waist to keep him upright in the saddle. "We're going home, to Rose." Home. The word resonated through Will's fading consciousness. Not his homestead, their home, his Rose's, and now somehow Mira's too. They rode through the snowy night, leaving Summit Junction and its burning station behind. Will drifted in and out of awareness, anchored only by Mira's steady presence at his back, her voice occasionally murmuring encouragement when he began to slip. The miles blurred together, marked only by the rhythm of hoofbeats and the gradual lightening of the eastern sky. Dawn approached, bringing with it the promise of a new day and the threat of Blackwood's pursuit once he recovered. "Almost there," Mira said, as familiar landmarks emerged from the pre-dawn darkness. "Stay with me, Will. Rose is waiting." The mention of his daughter provided fresh strength. Will straightened slightly in the saddle, forcing himself to remain conscious as they approached the clearing where his homestead stood. The cabin appeared untouched, no sign of disturbance since their departure. Snow had drifted against its walls, smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the surrounding forest stood peaceful in the gray light of early morning. "The hollow pine," Will directed weakly. "Northwest corner, Rose is there." Mira guided their horses toward the massive lightning-struck pine Will indicated. As they approached, Will summoned his remaining strength to whistle 3 short notes followed by 2 long ones. For a moment, nothing happened. Then branches, rustled snow fell away, and Rose emerged from the hollow's hidden entrance. Her small face lit with joy when she spotted them. "Papa, Miss Mira." She ran toward them through knee-deep snow nightgown tucked into borrowed trousers to keep it dry, her auburn hair flying behind her like a banner. "You came back!" Will slid from the saddle into Mira's supporting arms, then knelt to embrace his daughter as she reached them. The pain in his side receded momentarily, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude that she remained safe. "Of course we came back," he said, holding her tightly. "I promised, didn't I?" Rose nodded against his shoulder, then looked up at Mira with absolute trust. "You saved Papa." "We saved each other," Mira replied softly. Together they made their way to the cabin, Will leaning heavily on Mira Rose, darting ahead to open the door. Inside, the fire had burned low but not out, and warmth welcomed them back to safety. Will collapsed onto his bed, strength finally exhausted. Mira immediately began tending his injuries, cutting away blood-soaked clothing to reveal the full extent of damage. Her expression grew grave as she examined his side. 2 broken ribs, she assessed. "One has punctured something inside. You need a doctor." "Nearest doctor's in Denver," Will replied, his voice faint. 4 days' ride." "Then I'll do what I can," she said with determination. "I've treated field injuries before." As she worked cleaning and bandaging with practiced efficiency, Rose brought water and supplies. The child's earlier fear had transformed into purposeful assistance, watching Mira's every move with attentive eyes. "Will Blackwood come back?" Will asked when Mira had finished binding his ribs. She sat beside him, hands still bloody from her ministrations. "Eventually, but not immediately. The fire will occupy Summit Junction for days, and his position is compromised." She produced the salvaged document from her pocket. "This is enough to destroy him if made public. He knows that." "Then we use it," Will decided. "Insurance, like you said." Mira nodded. "I'll take it to the territorial governor myself once you're stable. With Blackwood's signature ordering civilian massacres, even the railroad can't protect him." And after, Will asked the question encompassing far more than immediate tactics. Mira's gaze turned to Rose, who had fallen asleep in a chair nearby, exhausted by the night's events. "After depends on many things," she said carefully. "On whether I'm welcome to stay." Will reached for her hand, enfolding it in his larger one despite the weakness in his limbs. "You were welcome from the moment Rose called you Mama," he said quietly. "I just took longer to see it." Something softened in Mira's expression, a guardedness falling away, revealing the woman beneath the survivor, beneath the operative, beneath the stranger who had appeared in a blizzard. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead briefly against his. Rest, she whispered. Heal. We'll face whatever comes together. As Will drifted toward sleep, pain temporarily dulled by willow bark tea and exhaustion, he held on to that promise. Whatever came Blackwood's revenge, the railroad's machinations, the uncertain future of a homestead standing in progress's path, they would face it together. No longer strangers thrown together by circumstance, but a family forged through crisis and choice. Spring came late to Colorado's high country that year. Snow lingered in shadowed ravines well into May, and the passes remained treacherous with meltwater and mud long after lower elevations had greened. Will's recovery proved slower than his impatient nature preferred, but steadier than Mira's initial fears. By the time mountain columbine bloomed across the hillsides, he could split wood again, though long rides still caused discomfort, where his ribs had knitted imperfectly. True to her word, Mira had traveled to Denver once Will stabilized, carrying Blackwood's incriminating order to the territorial governor. The resulting investigation sent shockwaves through the Continental Railroad's hierarchy. Blackwood disappeared before federal marshals could arrest him, fled to Mexico, according to rumors, his reputation and career destroyed. The railroad, pragmatic in its corporate calculation, disavowed all knowledge of Blackwood's unauthorized actions and dramatically revised its northern route plans. The new survey bypassed Will's homestead entirely, following a path 20 miles eastward through less mountainous terrain. "Cheaper to build there anyway," Will remarked when the news reached them. "They're just saving face." "And saving themselves from scandal," Mira added. The board chairman resigned quietly last month, sold his shares before they plummeted. They sat on the cabin's porch watching Rose teach her new puppy to retrieve a stick. The child had blossomed with the spring, her voice now constantly raised in song, or questions her earlier silence, just a painful memory. "What will you do now?" Will asked the question he'd been avoiding for weeks. "With Blackwood gone, your name cleared. You could go anywhere. Start fresh." Mira turned to study him, those green eyes still capable of seeing more than he intended to reveal. "Is that what you want? For me to leave?" "No," he answered simply, honestly. "But I need to know what you want." She looked out across the clearing to the mountains beyond, sunlight catching in her dark hair now grown long enough to reach the middle of her back. "Before I came here, I thought I was fighting for grand ideals, justice, national integrity, progress, defined by more than corporate balance sheets." She shook her head slightly. "Now I understand what truly matters." "Which is this," she said, gesturing to encompass the homestead. Rose's laughter, the cabin built by Will's hands. "A home. A family. A place where truth matters more than expediency. Where promises are kept." Will reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers. "Then stay," he said. "Not as our guest. Not as Rose's teacher. As my wife. If you'll have me." Mira's smile bloomed slowly, like spring itself, tentative at first, then radiant with certainty. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll stay." From the yard, Rose's voice called out, "Papa, Miss Mira, look what Ranger found." They rose together to investigate the child's discovery, moving as partners already accustomed to shared purpose and mutual support. Behind them, the cabin stood solid against the mountainside smoke curling from its chimney into the vast Colorado sky. A home built by one man's hands, saved by a woman's courage, and now sheltering a family created not by blood, but by choice, by recognition, by love that had found its way through blizzard and betrayal to something enduring as the mountains themselves. As they reached Rose, Will glanced back at the cabin once more, seeing not just the structure, but all it represented. A homestead claimed in wilderness, a refuge built after loss, a future reclaimed from those who would sacrifice individual lives for corporate empires. And at its heart, a truth as simple and profound as the mountains surrounding them home isn't merely a place. It's the people who stand beside you when darkness falls, and remain when dawn breaks across new fallen snow. The end.